Section 1. The Secret Life of Sideshow Bob. There is a man in Springfield who should not exist. Not in the way that burns should not exist, sustained by treatments and radiation and money so old it predates the Republic. Not in the way that Molman should not exist, dying and reappearing with the casual indifference of a background prop. This man should not exist in Springfield because Springfield, by every measure available, should have stopped him a long time ago. The legal system should have stopped him. The courts should have stopped him. The community's basic instinct for self-preservation should have stopped him. And yet, he keeps coming back, episode after episode, season after season, decade after decade. The tall man with the enormous raked hair and the Gilbert and Sullivan baritone and the rake tattoo across his fingers keeps finding his way back to the same town, the same family, the same 10-year-old boy, the same impossible situation where he is standing free on the streets of Springfield with no apparent reason why anyone allowed that to happen. His name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. The town knows him as Sideshow Bob. And the mystery of Sideshow Bob is not the mystery most people think it is. Most people, when they think about the Bob question, they think about Bart. They think about the obsession, the vendetta, the years of carefully maintained rage that Bob has directed at a child who, from one angle, was genuinely responsible for his downfall. That is the surface story. The obvious story. The story the show wants you to focus on so you do not ask the deeper questions. The deeper questions are darker and stranger and far more difficult to answer. Questions like, why has the legal system in Springfield failed to contain one of its most dangerous repeat offenders across more than a dozen separate criminal encounters? Why does Bob keep getting released? Why does a man with a documented history of attempted murder, successful criminal conspiracy, political corruption, and at least one completed homicide keep walking back into Springfield with nothing more than a menacing glare and a new scheme? And the deepest question of all, what does Bob's continued freedom tell us about the infrastructure of power in Springfield? And who specifically benefits from keeping Robert Terwilliger alive, mobile, and apparently untouchable by the mechanisms that are supposed to contain people like him? Let us start from the beginning, not from the moment Bart exposed him, but from before that. From who Bob was, before the rake and the big shoes and the clown car and the humiliation that reordered his entire existence. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. was born into what the show establishes as old Springfield money. His family is educated, cultured, refined. His brother Cecil, who appears in his own standalone episode, shares Bob's accent, his vocabulary, his particular brand of theatrical menace. The Terwilligers are not working class. They are not the product of Springfield's contaminated margins. They are the product of a world in which people speak in full sentences and read actual books, and consider themselves several rungs above the common herd that populates the rest of the town. Bob attended Yale. This is established canon. He studied the arts, the humanities, the things that serious people study when they want to understand the world at its most refined. By every objective measure, Robert Terwilliger had more going for him at the start of his life than almost anyone else in Springfield. Breeding, education, intellect, ambition. The raw materials of a genuinely successful life. And he ended up as the second banana to a clown. This is the wound that everything else flows from. Not Bart, not the rake, not the years in prison. The wound is this. Krusty the Clown. A man whose comedy consists primarily of physical violence and barely coherent stream of consciousness chaos. A man who cannot remember his own name half the time. A man who has been declared legally dead on multiple occasions and treated it as a scheduling inconvenience. That man got the show and Bob got the sidekick role. Bob, with his Yale degree and his baritone and his capacity for genuine wit, was handed a flower and a rubber mallet and told to stand slightly to the left of the man everyone actually came to see. Think about what that does to a person over time. Think about what it does to someone who genuinely believes they are better than this, who knows they are better than this, who can see their own potential reflected in every book they have read, and every aria they have sung, and every sophisticated observation they have made that went completely unnoticed because they were standing next to a man in grease paint, who was hitting himself with a ladder. The resentment that built up inside Bob over those years was not small and ordinary. It was architectural. It was load-bearing. It was the kind of resentment that when it finally breaks loose, it does not break in a normal direction. It breaks toward a child. The choice to frame Krusty for armed robbery, to use Bart's testimony as the linchpin of his scheme was not a random act of revenge against an innocent bystander. Bob chose Bart specifically because Bart represented the other side of the equation that Bob found intolerable: Krusty's audience. The children who watched the show and loved it unironically and genuinely believed that a man hitting another man with a pie was funny. Bart was the most enthusiastic member of that audience. Bart was the purest embodiment of everything Bob had spent years performing for and secretly despising. When Bart saw through the disguise, when a 10-year-old child walked into a convenience store and noticed that the man holding a shotgun had enormous feet that did not match the rest of his proportions, Bob's humiliation was complete. It was not just that he was caught, it was who caught him: a child. The precise category of person he had been performing for. The audience member. The worshiper at the altar of Krusty's mediocrity. He never forgave Bart for being smart enough to see him. Now, here is where the legal analysis begins, because this is where the show's reality starts to crack in ways that the comedy does not fully explain. Bob goes to prison. His conviction is sound. The evidence is clear. He framed a man for robbery, and a child saw through his disguise, and the legal system processed him efficiently and correctly. This is how the story should have ended. In any functional world, this is the last we would ever hear of Robert Terwilliger. He would serve his time. He would exit, quietly, into a life that did not intersect with The Simpsons at all. Maybe he would find a different career. Maybe he would move to a different city. Maybe he would simply become one of those characters who appeared in 2 episodes and then drifted out of the show's orbit. Instead, he became its most recurring antagonist. And the question is, how? The parole system in Springfield is, to put it generously, optimistic. Bob is paroled. He returns to Springfield. He immediately attempts to murder Bart. He is returned to prison. He is paroled again. He returns to Springfield. He attempts to murder Bart again. The cycle continues with a consistency that would be remarkable in a real penal system and is genuinely baffling inside the logic of the show. At what point does the parole board look at Robert Terwilliger's file, which by the 3rd or 4th encounter must be running to dozens of volumes, and conclude that this individual should perhaps not be released again? There is an episode, a genuinely underappreciated one, in which Bob is actually on the parole board. He votes against his own release. He acknowledges, while sitting on the committee that is considering whether to free him, that he should probably not be freed. The parole board's response is to release him anyway because he seems so sincere. This moment is played as absurdist comedy. A man arguing against his own parole and being granted it regardless is a good joke, but it is also the show telling you, in the clearest possible terms, that the parole system in Springfield is not a system at all. It is a performance. The appearance of a process without any of the actual mechanisms that would make a process function. Who is enabling this? That is the question that sits underneath every Bob episode and never gets asked directly. The Terwilliger family has money and connections. This is established. Cecil, Bob's brother, managed to insinuate himself into a major public works project, the construction of the Springfield hydroelectric dam, and nearly absconded with millions of dollars of public funds before Bart and Bob, in an unlikely alliance, stopped him. Cecil had access to that project because he had connections. The Terwilliger name opened doors. Bob presumably benefits from the same network of connections, the same quiet influence that allows old money families in small towns to navigate institutions in ways that ordinary people cannot. But there is something more specific operating here. Bob's legal outcomes across the series suggest a level of protection that goes beyond family connections. After his first imprisonment, he runs for mayor of Springfield. He wins. He wins because he votes multiple times, under different names, across multiple precincts, through a network of deceased voters and falsified registrations. This is not a minor crime. This is not the kind of thing that gets overlooked because someone has a good lawyer. Election fraud at this scale, discovered this clearly and publicly, should result in criminal charges that would keep Bob incarcerated for the better part of a decade. He serves a brief sentence and is released. After his encounter with the Simpsons in sideshow Bob Roberts, the episode in which his fraudulent electoral victory is exposed, the show moves on almost immediately. The gravity of what Bob did, the attempt to steal a democratic election in a municipality with a functioning government and courts, is processed by the system and then essentially forgotten. Bob is back within a few seasons, planning new schemes, operating with the same freedom of movement. The pattern suggests someone is keeping the door open. Consider the political landscape of Springfield. Burns owns the power infrastructure. Burns has purchased politicians before, openly and without apparent consequence. The episode in which he blocks out the sun establishes that his capacity for civic destruction is essentially unlimited when he decides to exercise it. Burns has shown, across multiple storylines, that he views the legal system as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a constraint to be respected. He has lawyers. He has judges. He has the kind of influence over municipal governance that accrues to a person who has been the single largest employer in a town for decades. Burns and Bob do not have an explicit relationship in the show's canon, but they share something important. Both of them are people for whom Springfield's legal system should represent an existential threat, and both of them navigate that system with an ease that should not be available to them. Burns escapes accountability for the power plant's violations episode after episode. Bob escapes accountability for violent criminal conduct episode after episode. In a town where the fix is apparently well and truly in, it is worth asking whether the same infrastructure that protects Burns might also, in some transactional way, extend to people like Bob. There is another angle here that the show has never fully explored but implies through its own structure. Bob is useful. Think about what Bob's escapades accomplish from a systemic perspective. Every time Bob shows up, every time he menaces Bart or schemes against the town, the entire attention of Springfield's civic and law enforcement apparatus focuses on him. WAGA mobilizes. The courts convene. Media coverage intensifies. And while all of that is happening, while every resource and every column inch is dedicated to the Sideshow Bob situation, nothing else is being looked at. The power plant runs its violations unexamined. Burns conducts his business unobserved. The regular corruption of Springfield's daily life proceeds without interference because everyone is looking at the tall man with the hair who is doing something theatrical in the direction of a child. Bob is a distraction, a recurring, self-generating distraction. A man whose theatrical nature and elaborate schemes are so much more interesting than the mundane institutional rot of Springfield that the town never has enough attention left over to ask the questions that would actually matter. This reading gives Bob's repeated releases a different character. They are not accidents. They are not the product of an incompetent system that simply fails to contain a dangerous person. They are investments. Bob is released periodically. He does something dramatic and attention-consuming, and the people who benefit from that attention being consumed get another quarter's worth of unscrutinized operation. Bob himself, of course, is not aware of this. That is the cruelty of the arrangement. Bob genuinely believes his obsession with Bart is personal, individual, the product of his own psychology and history. He has no idea, on this reading, that his obsession has been cultivated and sustained by a system that finds it convenient. He is not a puppet who knows he has strings. He is a man who believes he is acting entirely from his own motivations, which makes him the most effective kind of distraction, a genuine one. Now let us talk about the Bob-Bart relationship itself, because even stripped of the systemic analysis, it is one of the strangest and most unexplained relationships in the show. Bob hates Bart. This is foundational. Bob's entire post-prison identity is organized around this hatred. He plans elaborate schemes. He practices strangling specific objects in preparation for strangling Bart specifically. He has, in various episodes, constructed detailed models of the Simpson family home for the purpose of rehearsing the murder of one of its members. The intensity of this focus is not normal even by cartoon villain standards. But the show has also, in multiple episodes, depicted a version of Bob that is not focused on Bart. There is an Italian episode in which Bob, living under a false identity in a small Tuscan village, has a wife and a son, and appears to have achieved something like contentment. The wife is warm, the village is beautiful. The life looks, from the outside, like a genuine escape from the cycle. And then the Simpsons arrive in the same village on vacation, and Bob's equilibrium collapses immediately upon seeing Bart, and the murderous impulse reasserts itself with the force of something that was never truly extinguished. This moment is important. It shows that Bob without Bart is functional, that the hatred is not a constant internal state so much as a reaction to a specific stimulus. Bob does not wake up every morning consumed by thoughts of Bart Simpson. He wakes up, lives his life, does his things, and then when Bart appears, some switch gets thrown, and the obsession reignites as if no time has passed. What that pattern describes, psychologically, is not pure hatred. Pure hatred sustains itself. Pure hatred is a background radiation that never drops below a certain level. What Bob experiences is more like a trauma response, a conditioned reaction to a specific trigger that lies dormant until the trigger appears and then overwhelms every other consideration. Bart is Bob's trauma. Not in the sense that Bart did something terrible to Bob, though from Bob's perspective the exposure and humiliation certainly register as terrible. In the sense that Bart represents the moment Bob's life trajectory changed irrevocably. Before Bart, Bob was on one path. After Bart, he was on a completely different one. And the mind, in its effort to resolve unresolvable things, sometimes fixates on the agent of change as the cause of all subsequent suffering. Bob does not actually want to kill Bart. Or rather, that is not the deepest thing Bob wants. The deepest thing Bob wants is to return to the moment before Bart noticed him. To go back to being the sophisticated man with the Yale degree who was going to do something with his life eventually, who was suffering the indignity of the sidekick role temporarily, who had not yet been permanently defined by the worst moment of his existence. Killing Bart would not accomplish this. Bob knows this. There is a remarkable episode in which Bob actually succeeds in everything he has been planning, in which through a genuinely clever narrative mechanism, Bob finally manages to kill Bart Simpson, and his response to this achievement is not satisfaction. It is emptiness followed immediately by regret. Because without the pursuit, Bob has nothing. The obsession is not the obstacle to Bob's better life. The obsession is Bob's life. It is the thing that gives his days structure and meaning and forward momentum. As long as Bob is planning and scheming and working toward the murder of a child, he is a person with a purpose. The day he actually achieves that purpose, or the day he genuinely gives it up, is the day he has to confront the question of what he is actually for. And that question is too large and too frightening for a man who went to Yale to be a clown's sidekick to answer. There is one more dimension of the Bob mystery that the show has gestured toward without fully developing: his genuine gifts. Bob is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most talented people in Springfield. He is a gifted musician. His knowledge of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas is not just broad but deep, the kind of knowledge that comes from genuine love rather than mere familiarity. He has a voice that the show has deployed multiple times to stop an episode in its tracks and just let him sing. He is intelligent in a way that is different from Lisa's intelligence, less obsessively earnest, more darkly ironic, shaped by a lifetime of watching what he considers inferior people receive rewards he considers rightfully his. In an alternate Springfield, a Springfield where the system worked differently, or where Bob made different choices at crucial moments, Robert Terwilliger could have been a genuine contributor. Not in the burned sense of a man whose contributions are entirely self-serving, in the sense of someone who adds something real and lasting to the culture of a place. His operetta knowledge alone could have made him a genuine arts educator, the kind of teacher who changes how students understand music and performance and the relationship between comedy and tragedy. Instead, he is in prison again, planning the same plans, nursing the same obsession, walking the same loop. The tragedy of Sideshow Bob is not that he is a villain. It is that he is a person who could have been something else entirely, who took one wrong turn at a moment when everything else in his world was already steering him in the wrong direction, and who has been locked in the consequences of that turn ever since. The loop he is in is not so different from the loop every character in Springfield is in. The town resets. The characters do not change. And Bob, more than anyone else, is aware of the loop. He is the character who can see the bars of the cage most clearly. He just cannot figure out how to open them. And maybe that is the point. Maybe Springfield needs Bob in his cage. Not the prison cage, but the obsession cage, the Bart fixation cage, the theatrical villain cage that keeps him performing his function as distraction and spectacle. The day Bob genuinely transcends his obsession is the day he becomes someone with enough clarity to ask real questions about the town he keeps being returned to. And Springfield, as we have established, does not want that kind of person walking around free. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from and what time it is. Whether you are in bed at midnight or on your lunch break or 3 episodes deep into something else entirely, we want to know. And if this is the kind of content you want more of, the subscribe button is right there. It takes 1 second and it means we can keep doing this for as long as Springfield keeps running. Which, given everything we know about that town, is probably forever. The architecture of obsession. There is a detail about Sideshow Bob that the show has never quite resolved, and that rewards sustained attention: the specific mechanics of how he sustains his obsession across years of imprisonment. Prison is not a neutral environment for obsession. It is not a place that sustains fixation at the same level of intensity that produced it. Prison is, in most accounts and by most evidence, a place that either breaks the patterns that put someone there or calcifies them into something harder and less flexible than they were before. Bob's obsession appears to do neither of these things. It does not break. It does not calcify. It remains, across every period of incarceration the show depicts, essentially unchanged in its quality and its direction. Bob comes out of prison the same Bob who went in, oriented the same way, pursuing the same objective, with the same theatrical intensity he brought to every previous attempt. This is remarkable, not in the sense that the show treats it as remarkable, which it does not, presenting it as a reliable comedic convention, in the sense that it implies something specific about the psychological architecture of the obsession that goes beyond simple persistence. Bob's obsession does not fade in the absence of its trigger. It maintains itself, in the controlled environment of prison, without the stimulation that produced it, without access to the person it is organized around, without any of the contextual cues that normally sustain a fixation of this intensity. There are two possible explanations for this. The first is that the obsession has become so central to Bob's identity that it no longer requires external maintenance. It is not a reaction to Bart. It is a feature of Bob himself, as embedded in his self-conception as his love of opera or his Yale degree. He is the man who is trying to kill Bart Simpson the way he is the man who appreciates Gilbert and Sullivan. It is simply what he is now, regardless of context. The second explanation is that prison, for Bob, is not the interruption of the obsession. It is part of the obsession's cycle. The imprisonment is not a deviation from the pattern. It is the pattern. Bob engages in a scheme that brings him into conflict with Bart. The scheme is defeated. He goes to prison. He plans. He is released. He engages in a scheme. The prison phase is not the part of the cycle where the obsession pauses. It is the planning phase. The time when the theatrical mind that needs to have something to work on has the specific luxury of working without distraction. Bob in prison is not a man suffering the interruption of his purpose. He is a man with nothing but his purpose. In an environment stripped of every other demand and distraction, the obsession has room to become more detailed, more refined, more carefully constructed than it was the last time he attempted to act on it. He emerges from prison not with a diminished obsession but with a better planned one. The prison sentence is not punishment. For a man like Bob, it is a productivity retreat. This reframing of the prison release cycle changes what the system is actually doing when it releases Bob. It is not releasing a person who has been rehabilitated. It is not even releasing a person who has been contained. It is releasing a person who has been given a structured opportunity to improve his planning, who returns to the community with more focused objectives and more refined strategies than he had when he entered. Every sentence Bob serves is, from the obsession's perspective, an investment in the quality of the next attempt. If this is correct, then the parole board's repeated decisions to release Bob are even stranger than they initially appear. They are not simply the failures of an inadequate system to contain a dangerous person. They are the decisions of a system that is consistently releasing someone who emerges from confinement in a better position to pursue his objective than he was when he entered. The system is not just failing to contain Bob. It is repeatedly improving him and then returning him to the community. The question of who benefits from a better prepared Sideshow Bob is not one the show has ever asked directly. But the structural analysis suggests an answer. Everyone who benefits from the attention that Bob's return to Springfield consistently generates. The spectacle of a rehabilitated villain re-engaging in theatrical crime against a child is exactly the kind of story that a town like Springfield can consume indefinitely without ever running out of attention to give it. The Bob-Bart cycle is not a problem Springfield is trying to solve. It is a story Springfield is trying to sustain. The music that survives everything. One of the most consistent and least discussed elements of Sideshow Bob's characterization is his genuine musicianship and what it tells us about what survived the humiliation and the imprisonment and the obsession. The show has, across multiple episodes, stopped its own momentum to let Bob sing. Not as a joke, not as a character bit, but as a genuine musical performance that the show presents without irony and receives without distance. When Bob sings, the register of the scene changes. Something that was operating as comedy tips over into something else, something that asks to be received differently. His relationship with the operettas of Gilbert and Sullivan is not a character decoration. It is a genuine love. The specificity of the knowledge, the accuracy of the performance, the evident pleasure he takes in both, these are not the signs of someone who studied a subject strategically in order to use it as character signaling. They are the signs of someone who found something they genuinely loved and pursued it long enough and deeply enough to know it in their bones. This is the Bob that existed before the clown car, and before the prison, and before the obsession. A man who loved something real and beautiful, and who had the intelligence and the discipline to pursue it until it became part of who he was. The operettas are not what Bob uses to define himself. They are what was there before he needed to define himself through anything. They are the pre-self, the thing that existed before the life events that required the construction of a defined self. And the remarkable thing is that they survived. Through everything that happened to Robert Terwilliger, through every humiliation and every imprisonment and every new iteration of the obsession that consumed his life, the love of the music survived intact. When he sings, he is not performing. He is present in a way that is different from his theatrical self-presentation in every other context. The music gives him access to something that the rest of his life has systematically closed off. The capacity to be simply himself rather than the person his history has required him to become. This is why the music moments in Bob's episodes are the most important ones, even though they are always the briefest. They are the show's proof that what was there before the wound is still there, that the damage has not reached all the way down, that somewhere under the villain and the obsession and the theatrical self-destruction, the original person is still present, still capable of the kind of beauty that only genuine love produces. Bob is not redeemable in the sense of being able to stop the cycle. The show has established this clearly enough that hoping otherwise requires ignoring the evidence, but he is also not entirely consumed by the cycle, and the music is the proof of that. He is a man who became what his experience required him to become, and who carries inside that becoming the person he might otherwise have been, and who accesses that person, briefly and without apparent awareness, every time he sings. Springfield has never given him a context in which the music could be the whole story. That is the most specific and precise failure the town has visited on Robert Terwilliger. He had a gift that deserved a context, and the context it received was a children's television show and a clown's shadow and a cell and a long view of Evergreen Terrace. He will keep coming back, probably, as long as the show runs. He will be released, and he will plan, and he will act, and he will be thwarted, and he will be returned, and the cycle will turn over. And occasionally, in the middle of something that is supposed to be a crime, he will sing. And for however long the song lasts, Springfield will hear the thing that was there before any of this began. That is, in its way, the saddest and most beautiful thing the show has produced with this character. That the song survives. That it is still the same song. The rehearsal that never ends. Every time Sideshow Bob is released from prison and attempts to kill Bart Simpson and fails, the popular reading is that the show is repeating a joke. The same episode, more or less. Bob gets out, Bob schemes, Bob is foiled, Bob is returned to custody. The comedy of the repeated structure is the joke. Fine. But if you track what Bob is actually doing across his multiple escape and attempt cycles, the repetition is not as pure as the comedy framing suggests. He is not doing the same thing each time. He is iterating. His first serious attempt is relatively direct. He frames Krusty for armed robbery, eliminates his rival, and positions himself on television as the more sophisticated replacement. He does not specifically target Bart in this iteration. Bart targets him, exposes him, and has him arrested. Bob's awareness of Bart as an obstacle comes from this encounter. He did not plan for Bart. Bart was a variable he had not included in his calculation. Every subsequent attempt represents Bob's revised accounting of the Bart variable. He knows now that Bart is perceptive, persistent, and somehow capable of disrupting plans that Bob has constructed with considerably more intelligence than a 10-year-old child should be capable of matching. The plans become more elaborate partly because Bob is escalating emotionally, but also because he is genuinely trying to account for Bart's countermeasures. He is updating his model. This is unusual behavior for a character in a show that resets between episodes. Most characters in Springfield do not learn from their experiences in ways that carry forward between episodes. Homer makes the same category of mistake in episode 700 as he made in episode 7. Mrs. Krabappel's relationship with her students is no different in the later seasons than it was in the early ones. The show's floating timeline produces characters who exist in a perpetual present that does not accumulate in the direction of growth. Bob accumulates. He is one of the few characters in Springfield who demonstrably carries information forward between his episodes, who builds on previous encounters rather than simply repeating them, who is in a genuine process of development, even if that development is oriented towards something that civilization has decided is unacceptable. The tragedy of this is real. Bob is the most adaptable, the most genuinely learning character in the show's universe, and the only thing he is learning to do better is something the universe will not allow him to complete. The rehearsal is endless because the completion is impossible, and the impossibility is structural. Bob cannot kill Bart because the show needs Bart alive. Bob cannot successfully reinvent himself because the show needs Bob to be the villain. Bob is rehearsing for a performance that the venue will never actually book, and the only thing he can do with that specific situation is become more and more accomplished at a form of preparation whose product will never be produced. This is the purest expression of Springfield's loop applied to a character who has enough intelligence to understand the loop exists. Homer is in the loop and cannot see it. Burns is in the loop and has found a way to profit from it. Bob is in the loop and is fully aware of it and cannot escape it regardless of how thoroughly he understands its structure. Knowledge, in Springfield, is not sufficient for freedom. The loop holds even when you can name it. What Kelsey Grammer understood. There is a dimension of Sideshow Bob that exists outside the show's fictional universe, but that is relevant to understanding why the character has sustained the quality he has across decades of episodic deployment. The specific intelligence that Kelsey Grammer brought to the vocal performance and what that intelligence made possible. Voice acting and animation is a distinct craft from screen performance. The entire communicative task has to be accomplished through the voice alone, without the physical presence that screen actors rely on to convey emotional specificity, status relationships, the fine gradations of feeling that the face and body express without requiring the voice to carry them explicitly. The voice actor who is exceptional at their craft is the one who has internalized this constraint so completely that it does not feel like constraint, who has found, within the instrument of the voice alone, all the expressive range that the full physical instrument provides to the screen actor. Grammer understood Bob in a way that made this possible. He understood that Bob's tragedy is not his villainy. Bob's villainy is the expression of his tragedy, the coping mechanism of a man whose genuine gifts were never accommodated by the world he inhabited and who has redirected those gifts toward the only application that makes him feel like the person he believes himself to be. Grammer played this in the voice. Not the villainy, but the wound underneath it. The specific quality of a man who is better than almost everyone around him and knows it, and has found that this knowledge, rather than producing the outcomes it theoretically should, has produced isolation and frustration, and the specific pain of being perpetually underestimated by a world that is not capable of seeing what he actually is. This is a performance that requires genuine empathy for a character who is also genuinely dangerous, and Grammer sustained that empathy across decades without losing either the character's menace or his pathos. This is harder than it sounds. The tendency in comedy performance is to emphasize one register or the other, to play the villain for laughs at the expense of genuine threat, or to play the threat in ways that undermine the comedy. Grammer found and sustained the exact position between these registers where both could coexist, where the comedy arose from the gap between Bob's self-perception and his circumstances rather than from Bob being simply ridiculous, and where the threat was always credible enough to make the comedy's resolution feel earned rather than cheap. The result is a character who has outlasted most of his contemporaries in the show's universe because he is more fully inhabited than they are. Springfield is full of one-note characters who are funny precisely because they are one note. The repetition of the single note is the joke. Bob is not one note. He is the show's most fully orchestrated character, and the reason is that the person performing him understood what he was doing with a level of specificity that one-note performances do not require. Number. Section 2. The True Mystery of Bart's Soul. In Season 7, Episode 4, Bart Simpson sells his soul to Milhouse Van Houten for $5. This is presented as a joke. The premise is simple. Bart does not believe in souls. He thinks the concept is invented by adults to manipulate children into behaving well. He proves his disdain for the concept by writing Bart Simpson's Soul, on a piece of paper and exchanging it for $5, which he immediately spends on something forgettable. The joke is that Bart is wrong, that the soul is real, that selling it has immediate and tangible consequences that Bart spends the rest of the episode desperately trying to reverse. But the episode does not end where most people remember it ending. It does not end with Bart triumphantly recovering his soul and everything returning to normal. It ends with something far stranger, far more ambiguous, and far more philosophically troubling than the setup suggested it would be. Let us walk through it carefully, because the details matter. After selling the paper to Milhouse, Bart begins to notice changes. Automatic doors do not open for him. Breath on a window does not produce fog. Animals do not react to his presence the way they used to. His dog, Santa's little helper, who has always been enthusiastically affectionate with Bart, suddenly looks at him with distance and uncertainty, as if recognizing that something essential is missing. These are not dramatic changes. They are quiet, accumulative, the kind of wrongness that builds at the edges of perception before it becomes undeniable. And Bart starts to dream. Or rather, he stops dreaming in the way he used to. The episode depicts his nights as empty, his sleep as mechanical, as if the internal world that generates dreams has been switched off. Every other member of the family is shown dreaming vividly. Homer dreams about food. Lisa dreams about something complex and meaningful that involves her saxophone. Maggie dreams something we are never shown but which is presumably extraordinary given everything we have established about her. Bart lies in the same house, breathing the same air, and experiences nothing. This is where the episode becomes something more than a premise and punchline structure. The absence of dreams is the show's most specific claim about what the soul actually is and what losing it actually costs. The soul, in the Springfield Files universe, is not primarily a moral register. It is the creative source. It is the part of a person that generates inner experience beyond mere biological function. Bart without his soul still eats and breathes and walks and talks. He still recognizes people and responds to stimuli and participates in the mechanics of daily life. What he loses is the dimension of experience that makes daily life feel like anything at all. He is not bad without his soul, he is hollow. Now, here is the theological problem the episode quietly introduces and never resolves. Milhouse sells the soul to Comic Book Guy. Comic Book Guy sells it to someone else. The paper passes through multiple hands before Lisa, understanding the gravity of the situation in a way nobody else in the family does, uses her own money to purchase it back. She returns the paper to Bart. He holds it to his chest, and in the episode's final image, which is clearly meant to be read as confirmation that everything is fine, Bart has his soul back and the story is over. Except Lisa buying back a piece of paper is not the same thing as recovering a soul. The show's own internal logic, as established by the episode's earlier scenes, treats the piece of paper as a genuine vessel for Bart's soul. But if that is true, then the soul was a transferable object that passed through multiple owners during the time Milhouse had it. Each of those owners held it, presumably affected it in some way, and then relinquished it. A soul that has been owned by Comic Book Guy and whoever came after him is not the same soul that left Bart's body. Or is it? The episode does not say. It shows Bart's reunion with the paper and leaves the question of what exactly was transferred, altered, or corrupted during the soul's commercial journey entirely open. And the reason this matters, the reason it is worth sitting with rather than dismissing as overthought children's television, is that the episode is clearly not a children's episode in any simple sense. It is an episode about whether children have inner lives, about whether the casual nihilism of a 10-year-old who says he does not believe in souls is actually as inconsequential as he thinks it is. The answer the episode gives is no, it is not inconsequential. There are real costs to spiritual carelessness. But then the episode ends before it can address the deeper question, which is, what comes back when a compromised thing returns? Consider what we know about Bart in the seasons that follow this episode. Bart continues to display the qualities that the episode associates with soulfulness: creativity, emotional responsiveness, the capacity for genuine connection. He also continues to display qualities that the episode was suggesting were absent without the soul: spontaneity, a natural relationship with animals, the ability to generate dreams. By the show's own earlier criteria, Bart seems fine. The soul appears to have returned intact. But there is a thread that runs through many post-Soul episode Bart storylines that, when you are aware of it, becomes very hard to stop noticing. A particular quality of Bart's recklessness that sometimes tips over from cartoon mischief into something that feels more genuinely unmoored, a tendency towards self-destruction that exceeds even the demands of the jokes that are built around it. A recurring pattern of Bart doing things that are not in his own interest, not in his family's interest, not in anyone's interest, for reasons that the episode will gesture at but never quite fully explain. The Soul episode, if taken seriously as more than a one-off premise, raises the possibility that what came back in that piece of paper was something that had been changed by its journey. That the soul Lisa bought back from whatever chain of transactions it had passed through was Bart's in the same way that a thing repaired extensively is still technically the same thing. The continuity is maintained. The label is the same, but something about the interior has shifted in ways that may not be immediately visible but that accumulate over time. There is an additional layer here that the show has never directly addressed: the metaphysics of soul transfer in the Springfield universe. The episode establishes through its own logic that souls can be written on paper and exchanged for money. This is not treated as unusual by any of the characters who interact with the transaction. Milhouse takes the paper seriously enough to keep it. Comic Book Guy is willing to purchase it as a genuine commodity. The universe of the show accepts the premise that a soul has material reality and can be handled and traded like any other item of value. If souls can be traded, they can be stolen. They can be lost. They can presumably be destroyed. And if one soul can be transferred via paper, there is no logical reason why other residents of Springfield have not, at various points in the show's 36-year run, experienced similar transactions or losses, whether they were aware of it or not. The three-eyed fish has an unexpected number of eyes. The residents have unexpected numbers of fingers. The biological rules of Springfield are flexible in ways that the radiation theory partially explains. But the spiritual rules of Springfield, if the Soul episode is to be taken as establishing spiritual rules, are equally flexible. And in a town where flexible rules are consistently exploited by the people with the power to exploit them, the soul economy of Springfield is a frontier that nobody has mapped and nobody is apparently regulating. Who else in Springfield might have sold something they did not fully understand, or had something taken from them through transactions they did not consciously enter into? Burns, in this framework, becomes an interesting figure. A man who has lived for over a century, who maintains his existence through chemical and radioactive intervention, who exhibits the kind of ruthless efficiency in accumulating wealth and power that the show has consistently associated with a fundamental absence of conventional human warmth. Burns is not without affect. He has shown in specific episodes the capacity for something like genuine emotion, but his baseline is a coldness that the show has never fully explained through environmental or biographical causes alone. What if Burns's longevity is not purely medical? What if the weekly treatments are the visible mechanism of a sustaining arrangement that has a less visible spiritual dimension? A man who has made the arrangements Burns has made, who has destroyed the lives Burns has destroyed, who has made the choices Burns has made across a century of operation, might have arrived at a point where the conventional economy of the soul, the getting and spending that everyone participates in without awareness, resolved in a particular and permanent direction. Burns never dreams, as far as the show establishes. He does not appear to have an inner life that extends beyond the immediate tactical. His nostalgia, when it appears, is for objects and arrangements rather than for people or experiences. He remembers things with precision, but without apparent warmth. Even his affection for Smithers, which is the closest thing Burns has to a genuine emotional attachment, operates primarily as an appreciation of a useful instrument rather than as a recognition of another person's inherent worth. This is not proof. The show does not make this claim explicitly, but it is consistent with the Soul episode's logic, and it extends that logic into territory that the show has, perhaps deliberately, never fully illuminated. Now let us talk about what the Soul episode says about Lisa. Lisa is the one who solves the problem. Lisa is the one who understands immediately what Bart's loss means, and takes it seriously when everyone else, including Bart himself for much of the episode, is treating it as a joke or a nuisance. Lisa spends her own money she has saved and earned and protected with the conscientiousness that defines her relationship with resources, to buy back something her brother gave away carelessly. This is not remarkable in terms of plot mechanics. It is a standard little sister saves big brother structure. What is remarkable is the conversation Lisa and Bart have afterward, and specifically what Lisa says about the soul. She tells Bart that whether or not he believes in the soul, it is the part of him that is uniquely him. not his body, which is a biological machine that runs on the same basic programming as everyone else's. Not his memories, which can be altered or erased or damaged. The soul, as Lisa defines it in this moment, is the irreducible thing, the thing that makes him specifically Bart rather than any other 10-year-old boy in Springfield or anywhere else. And then she goes further. She tells him that she would not want to live in a world without Bart's soul in it. This is not a joke. The delivery is not comedic. It is one of those moments the show inserts into the middle of its silliest premises, where someone says something completely sincere and the sincerity lands with a weight that the comedy around it cannot quite contain. Lisa, who is 8 years old, has a more sophisticated understanding of what makes a person irreplaceable than most adults in Springfield manage across their entire lifetimes. The reason this moment matters for the soul mystery is that it implies something about how Lisa thinks, specifically, that she is already operating with an intuitive understanding of personhood and identity that goes well beyond what her age or her context should have produced. The Lisa who articulates that theory of the soul is not a child who has been taught it. She is a child who has arrived at it through observation and reflection and the particular quality of attention she brings to a world that consistently frustrates her capacity for understanding. Which brings us back to the soul as creative source. The capacity to generate inner experience, to dream, to be present to the texture of existence rather than merely processing it. Lisa has this in abundance. It is the source of her music, her activism, her loneliness, her joy. It is also the source of her suffering, because a capacity for inner experience that rich, in a world as flattened and institutional as Springfield, is as much curse as gift. And Bart, who sold his soul for $5 and had it returned by his sister, exists somewhere in the middle. He has the capacity. He demonstrates it in flashes. But there is always the question, the quiet background question that the soul episode planted and never fully answered, of whether the capacity that came back is identical to the one that left. Whether the Bart who received the paper from Lisa's hands is the same Bart who handed it to Milhouse in the schoolyard. The show needs Bart to be the same Bart. The floating timeline demands it. The reset button that erases consequences between episodes ensures it. But the soul episode, more than almost any other, makes the reset feel earned rather than convenient. Because the show went to the trouble of establishing that souls are real, that they matter, that losing one has genuine costs, it also quietly established that recovering one is not necessarily the same as never having lost it at all. Bart Simpson sold his soul and got it back. And for 36 years of episodes since then, the show has been built on the premise that this transaction was fully reversed, fully settled, closed, with no remainder. But the logic of the episode itself does not quite support that clean resolution. There is a gap between what the show shows and what the show's own internal rules allow for. And in that gap, in the space between the paper changing hands and Bart's relief at holding it again, something happened that the show has never been willing to name. What came back was Bart, mostly. The same boy, the same mischief, the same capacity for connection and creativity, and the occasional burst of genuine heroism. But the experience of absence, the nights without dreams, the animals who did not recognize him, the automatic doors that would not open, that experience left a trace. It left the knowledge, somewhere below conscious thought, that the thing that makes him Bart is not as permanently and securely his as he assumed before Milhouse offered him $5 and he thought it was funny to accept. Every person who has ever sold something they could not fully value and then spent years understanding what they gave away knows this particular feeling. Bart Simpson is 10 years old and he knows it already. He just does not have the language for it yet. And the show, to its enormous credit, understood that not having the language for something is not the same as not carrying it. It just looks different from the outside. It looks like a boy who gets into trouble and sometimes does not seem to know why. The theology of the Springfield universe. The soul episode does not exist in isolation. It is the most explicit engagement with a theological dimension that the show has been quietly building for its entire run. And when you look at the soul episode in the context of the show's broader theological universe, the questions it raises become considerably larger than the episode's specific premise would suggest. Springfield has an established relationship with the divine. God exists within the show's universe. He has appeared, spoken, made his preferences known on multiple occasions. The show has handled this with a characteristic mixture of irreverence and genuine affection, neither mocking the concept of divine existence nor committing to any specific theological position about what divine existence implies for the people it coexists with. What the show has committed to, through the accumulated evidence of its theological episodes, is that God within the Springfield universe is a specific personality. He has preferences, he has a sense of humor, he finds certain people more interesting than others. He is, in the most technical sense of the word, personal. He engages with individuals as individuals rather than through abstract cosmic principle. Homer is his favorite. This is not a formal theological claim the show makes explicitly, but it is the overwhelming implication of the evidence. God talks to Homer. God listens to Homer. God's interactions with Homer have a quality of genuine engagement, the kind of attention you pay to someone whose company you find genuinely enjoyable, rather than someone you are managing or monitoring. Homer in God's company is recognizable as the person he always is: enthusiastic, confused, good-natured, chaotic, endearing in ways he does not understand and would not if you explained them to him. And within this established theological framework, Bart's soul exists as a real thing with real properties and a real consequence when it is absent. The soul episode is not a departure from the show's normal theological position. It is a continuation of it. The show has always treated the spiritual dimension of its universe as real, has always depicted the consequences of spiritual states as genuine rather than metaphorical, and the soul episode is the most specific and extended exploration of that dimension applied to a single character's experience. What the soul episode adds to the show's theology is the mechanism of transfer. If souls can be written on paper and exchanged, they exist within an economy. Not a metaphorical economy, a literal one, with a medium of exchange, prices, transactions, and the accumulated consequences of those transactions. The soul of Bart Simpson was worth $5 to Milhouse. It was worth whatever comic book guy paid for it. It was worth, to Lisa, every penny of her personal savings. The values assigned to the soul in these transactions are comic in their disproportion. $5 for an immortal soul is a joke. But the joke rests on the assumption that the soul has a value that $5 cannot capture, which is itself a theological claim. That there are things whose worth exceeds any price, that the economy of souls operates on principles that are not reducible to standard market logic. The show makes this claim and then immediately complicates it by depicting the soul as something that moves through the market anyway, that changes hands for prices that are manifestly inadequate, that can be lost and recovered and traded and returned, and that all of this commerce in something sacred, has consequences that the market cannot fully account for. This is a more sophisticated theological position than the comedy framing would suggest. The show is not saying souls are real and inviolable. It is saying souls are real, and therefore vulnerable to exactly the same forces that everything real in Springfield is vulnerable to. The indifference of institutions, the exploitation of the powerful, the casual negligence of people who do not understand the value of what they hold. Bart gave away his soul because he did not believe it had value. The show's argument, made through the mechanism of its consequences, is that this is precisely the kind of mistake that the Springfield environment systematically produces. A town that has been trained by its institutions to undervalue what is genuine and essential in favor of what is commercially expedient. A town that looks at three-eyed fish and says, well, that is just how it is around here. A town that votes to make the truth illegal when the truth is inconvenient is a town that would produce children who do not know what their souls are worth. Bart's mistake is not personal, it is environmental. He did not arrive at his $5 valuation of his soul through some specific character failure. He arrived at it through a lifetime of living in Springfield, where the things that are most essential to human dignity and human flourishing are consistently the things that the most powerful people in town have the most interest in seeing undervalued. The soul of a power plant worker's son is worth $5 in the moral economy of Springfield, because the power plant worker himself has been valued at slightly above the cost of replacement for his entire adult life. The lesson is transmitted downward. Bart absorbs it. He writes it on a piece of paper and hands it to Milhouse for $5. And the comedy of the premise is the comedy of something true that has been made visible. Lisa knows this. Lisa is the one who understands that the $5 valuation is wrong, who pays the price to correct it, who frames the correction not in terms of souls and theology, but in terms of what she cannot afford to live without. Her articulation of why Bart's soul matters, which is grounded not in doctrine but in love, is the most honest theological statement the show has ever produced. You do not need a theory of the soul to understand that the specific, irreducible uniqueness of a person is valuable. You only need to love someone enough to notice when it is absent. What the episode actually proves. The soul episode is almost unique in the show's history for what it proves, rather than what it depicts. Most Simpsons episodes prove that characters are capable of specific things. Homer is capable of genuine sacrifice. Lisa is capable of compromise. Bart is capable of genuine heroism when the stakes are high enough. These are character demonstrations. They show us what the characters can do. The soul episode proves something about the universe the characters inhabit, rather than about the characters themselves. It proves that there are things within Springfield's reality that have value beyond what the market assigns them. That loss of these things has genuine consequences, and that the recovery of these things, while possible, is not identical to never having lost them. This is a form of proof that the show rarely engages in because engaging in it requires the show to commit to stakes that exceed the comedy frame's capacity to absorb. The soul episode commits to those stakes fully, within the episode, and then the loop resets and the stakes return to comedy scale, and the proof disappears into the background. But it is still there. Somewhere in the accumulated reality of Springfield, it is established that souls are real and losable and worth recovering. That a piece of paper with a name on it can hold something essential, that a child with $5 can make a transaction she does not fully understand, and that her sister, who understands it completely, will spend her own savings to fix it because some things are not worth saving the money. The soul episode is the show at its most specific and most honest about what actually matters in its universe. Everything that follows it, every reset and every comedy and every couch gag and every 36-year loop, happens in a Springfield where this is established and known and then not talked about, the way Springfield does not talk about the things it knows. The soul is there, probably, the night before the transaction. There is an episode of Bart's life that the show never depicts, but that the soul episode implies, the night before he sold his soul, when he was an ordinary 10-year-old boy who had not yet made the decision that the next morning would make. He did not plan it. This is important. Bart did not go to bed the previous night considering the theological implications of the exchange he was about to propose. He went to bed as he always goes to bed, restless, marginally planning whatever mischief the next day offered, not particularly reflecting on anything because reflection is not a significant feature of Bart Simpson's relationship with his own interior life. He woke up the next morning and went to Sunday school, and the question of his soul arose in the specific context of a teacher asking whether anyone actually believed they had one. And Bart, being Bart, offered the challenge that felt natural in the moment, a $5 bet. The impulsiveness is the whole story. Bart did not calculate that his soul was worth $5. He did not decide that spiritual continuity was a less valuable possession than an immediate cash payout. He responded to the social dynamics of the specific moment he was in, with the specific bravado that is his consistent mode of navigating social situations where vulnerability might otherwise be visible, and the transaction happened before he had actually thought about what a soul was or whether he had one or what losing it would mean. This is recognizable as adolescent behavior, the willingness to discard something you cannot fully evaluate, because evaluation requires admission of uncertainty, and uncertainty is vulnerability, and vulnerability in a specific social context is unacceptable. Bart has never found uncertainty acceptable as a public position. He is always certain. He is always bold. He is always the one who does the thing that other people only talk about doing. And in this specific moment, in this specific Sunday school classroom, the thing that other people only talked about doing was trading their soul away for $5, and Bart did it. The consequences were real. The show did not soften them or reframe them or suggest that what happened was not genuinely significant. The consequences arrived with a consistency and a specificity that established, within the episode's terms, that something had genuinely changed in Bart's relationship with the world. The dog that did not recognize him. The window that would not fog. The dreams that did not come. The small, quiet, daily confirmations that something was different, that something that had always been present was now absent, and that the absence could not simply be undone by willing it to stop. He did not know how to name what was missing. The show handled this with considerable care. Bart did not immediately conceptualize his condition in theological terms. He did not walk around knowing his soul was gone and experiencing the theological implications of that loss. He experienced the symptoms without the diagnosis, the altered quality of his daily existence without a framework for understanding why things felt different. And the not knowing was its own part of the consequence, the specific experience of someone who has done something that changed their situation in a way they cannot name, and that the people around them either do not notice or do not mention. Lisa noticed. Lisa, who notices everything that the rest of the family misses, who is the show's designated perceiver of things that are present but not acknowledged. She noticed and she responded not with lecture or moral instruction, but with the specific response of someone who loves a person and is watching them lose something they do not know how to protect. She bought it back. That act of purchase, made with her own savings, with money she had accumulated for her own purposes, is the most complete expression of what loving someone in a way that exceeds accounting actually looks like. The price of everything. The Springfield economy assigns prices to things that should not have prices. This is not a unique feature of Springfield. Every economy does this to some degree, assigns exchange values to things whose intrinsic values exceed what any exchange can capture. But Springfield does it with a consistency and a specificity that the show has used repeatedly to make observations about how economic logic colonizes domains that it should not reach. Krusty sells products associated with his name that have no meaningful connection to the things his name originally meant. The show treats this as comedy, but the comedy rests on a genuine observation that the brand as economic instrument is indifferent to the values that the brand originally expressed, that it will attach to anything that generates revenue regardless of whether the attachment is coherent or honest. Burns treats everything as having a price. His relationships are transactional by design and by philosophical commitment. He does not form attachments in the way that the show's other characters do, and the episodes that have explored his interior life most directly suggest that this is not entirely a matter of choice. That Burns's century plus of operating within an economy that values everything in the terms of exchange has left him with diminished capacity for the forms of value that exchange cannot capture. And then there is Bart's soul, sold for $5, recovered for an unspecified sum by a sister who understood its value in precisely the terms that the market cannot accommodate. Lisa's purchase was not a market transaction in the meaningful sense. It was an act of love expressed through the mechanism of the market, because the mechanism of the market was what the situation made available. She used the market's instrument to accomplish something the market's logic cannot account for. The $5 that originally exchanged the soul captured a transaction. The recovery captured a relationship. The show has never explicitly articulated this distinction. It did not need to. The episode's emotional logic makes it clear without articulation that what Lisa bought back was not a commodity that happened to have been mispriced. It was something whose price had been wrong from the beginning, and whose recovery at any price was the right outcome, and whose recovery by Lisa specifically was the right outcome in a way that a commercial resale would not have been, even at the correct price. Springfield's economy can price souls. What it cannot do is account for the specific wrong of the original pricing, or for the specific rightness of the specific recovery. These are transactions that exceed the ledger's capacity to record, and the show's most honest episodes are the ones that depict things happening in Springfield that the ledger cannot record, that exist in the gap between what the economy can capture and what the people inside the economy actually need. Number. Section 3. Springfield's hidden criminal underworld. Springfield has a crime problem. This will not surprise anyone who has spent any time watching the show. Springfield's crime is visible, constant, and consistently played for laughs. Fat Tony's mob operates out of the Legitimate Businessman Social Club, a name that has the same relationship to legitimate business that the Springfield nuclear power plant has to safety standards. Technically, it is a label. Practically, it describes the opposite of what is actually happening. Chief Wagum is the town's primary law enforcement officer, a man who has approached his duties with an enthusiasm that unfortunately has never extended to competence. The Springfield Police Department is an institution that has failed so consistently and so completely that the town has apparently factored its failure into every other system and simply built the expected level of crime into the basic, operating assumptions of daily life. But the visible crime, the Fat Tony mob, and the robbery plots, and the occasional murder that the show presents as newsworthy within its own universe, is not the most interesting criminal story in Springfield. The most interesting criminal story is the one happening underneath, the one that is not organized in the traditional sense, not unified by a single boss or a single code, but that permeates the civic and institutional life of the town so thoroughly that it has become functionally indistinguishable from normal operation. Springfield does not have a crime problem in the sense of crime existing alongside legitimate institutions. Springfield has a crime problem in the sense that the institutions themselves are the crime. Let us build this case methodically, because the evidence is everywhere, and the show has been presenting it so consistently for so long that it has become invisible through sheer repetition. Start with the courts. Springfield has a functioning judicial system. There are judges, there are juries, there are lawyers, there are trials. The apparatus of justice is present and operational. And across 36 seasons, the outcomes of that apparatus have been so consistently skewed toward people with money and connections that it is essentially impossible to read them as random. Burns escapes accountability for power plant violations that would result in criminal prosecution in any functional legal environment. Fat Tony operates his criminal enterprise so openly that the sign on the door might as well read "Organized Crime Operating Here," and yet his contact with the legal system is minimal and rarely consequential. Politicians in Springfield commit fraud, accept bribes, and manipulate elections with a regularity that suggests these activities are understood to be part of the job rather than violations of it. The courts are not broken. A broken court is one that fails to achieve justice despite attempting to do so. Springfield's courts do not appear to be attempting justice in any consistent way. They appear to be managing the appearance of justice while ensuring that its actual outcomes do not disrupt the existing distribution of power. Judge Snyder, who issues the decree in the Principal and the Pauper episode making it illegal to discuss the truth about Principal Skinner's identity, is the most explicit expression of this. He is not a corrupt judge in the traditional sense of a man taking money to rule in a particular direction. He is something more normalized than that. A judge who has so thoroughly internalized the values of the community that keeps him in power that he can issue a decree criminalizing honesty without apparent awareness that this is extraordinary. The decree is the product of a system that has been optimized for social maintenance rather than actual justice, and a judge who is the product of that system will produce outcomes that serve social maintenance rather than actual justice, without ever having to be explicitly told to do so. Now look at Fat Tony more carefully, because the show's treatment of organized crime in Springfield is not as simple as it initially appears. Fat Tony, whose full name is Marion Anthony D'Amico, is a mob boss. This is established and never really complicated. He runs protection rackets. He disposes of bodies. He controls the distribution of certain goods through methods that are not available to legitimate businesses. He is, by any reasonable standard, a significant criminal operating in the open in a mid-sized American town, and the fact that he does so without significant interference from law enforcement is presented as a running joke. But the show also, in multiple episodes, depicts Fat Tony as a figure with genuine community relationships. He has children. Those children attend Springfield Elementary. They interact with Bart and Lisa in relatively normal school contexts. And the show treats the children of organized crime figures with a humanity that complicates the simple villain framing. Fat Tony himself, in his interactions outside of criminal contexts, exhibits a kind of courtly warmth that the show clearly finds charming. He is polite, he uses elevated vocabulary, he quotes things, he has opinions about food that he expresses with genuine passion. This is not accidental. The show is doing something specific with Fat Tony that it does with many of its secondary characters. It is making him a person rather than a type. And in making him a person, it is also making the criminal system he represents something more complex than a threat to be neutralized. Fat Tony's Springfield is not a place that is being invaded by outside crime. Fat Tony's Springfield is a place that produced him, sustains him, and in various ways depends on him. The relationship between Fat Tony and the legitimate economy of Springfield is not adversarial, it is symbiotic. The mob provides services that legitimate businesses either cannot or will not provide. It enforces contracts in contexts where the legal system is too slow or too captured to be useful. It recycles money through legitimate-appearing businesses in ways that make it a meaningful participant in the local economy. And it does all of this with a discretion that the people who benefit from its services find preferable to the alternative, which would be either chaos or a level of legal scrutiny that might illuminate things about Springfield's economy that nobody actually wants illuminated. Burns and Fat Tony have never had an explicitly depicted relationship in the show's canon, but the structural analysis of how power works in Springfield makes an implicit relationship almost logically necessary. Burns needs workers who will not ask questions. Fat Tony has workers who have been professionally trained not to ask questions. Burns needs political outcomes managed. Fat Tony has a demonstrated capacity for managing political outcomes. Burns needs certain problems to disappear without leaving legal traces. Fat Tony has infrastructure for that. This is not conspiracy theorizing for its own sake. It is the application of the show's own established logic to an underexplored corner of its universe. The show has told us how power works in Springfield. The show has told us who holds power and how they maintain it. The show has told us that institutions in Springfield serve maintenance rather than justice. Given all of that, the absence of an explicit Burns-Tony connection is not evidence that the connection does not exist. It is evidence that the show has chosen to leave this particular thread deliberately unexamined. Now look at the police. Wagum is the show's primary vehicle for police comedy, and he earns that role by being genuinely, consistently, almost heroically incompetent. He misidentifies suspects. He loses evidence. He confuses perpetrators with victims. He draws his weapon in situations that do not require a weapon and fails to draw it in situations that do. He is, as a police chief, the kind of man who arrives at crime scenes primarily for the snacks. But Wagum's incompetence is not distributed randomly. It is directional. He is incompetent in specific directions and considerably more effective in others. When the situation involves the persecution of someone the town's power structure wants persecuted, Wagum's effectiveness improves dramatically. Homer is arrested with relative efficiency on multiple occasions. Ordinary Springfield residents who run afoul of the established order find themselves processed with more alacrity than the organized crime operation and the billionaire whose plant is poisoning the water supply. The incompetence is selective, which is functionally not incompetence at all. It is discretion. Wagum is not failing to police Springfield. He is policing the people the system wants policed and not policing the people the system wants left alone. From the perspective of the people who benefit from his service, he is working exactly as intended. There is a specific episode that crystallizes this. Homer accidentally becomes a gun dealer, and the show explores the regulatory environment around firearms in Springfield with its characteristic mixture of comedy and unease. What emerges from that episode is a picture of a regulatory environment that is porous in very specific ways. The rules exist. They are on the books. They would, in theory, prevent certain outcomes. And they fail to do so not because of dramatic corruption, but because of the kind of systematic under-resourcing and institutional indifference that allows dangerous things to accumulate without anyone being directly responsible for, allowing them. This is the most accurate description of how real institutional failure operates, not through villainous conspiracy, but through the diffuse, deniable, distributed erosion of systems that were never given the resources or the will to actually function. Springfield's institutional failure is not primarily produced by bad actors doing bad things. It is produced by good actors, or at least actors who understand themselves as good, doing nothing, looking away, deciding that a particular problem is someone else's problem, and moving on. And the result, accumulated across 36 seasons of looking away and moving on, is a town where the criminal infrastructure is as normalized as the civic infrastructure, where Fat Tony sits on the same social plane as legitimate business people, where the police chief and the mob boss have a relationship that is not quite friendly and not quite adversarial and entirely functional for the purposes of maintaining the status quo, where a billionaire can poison a town's water supply for decades without criminal consequence because the mechanisms that would produce that consequence have been, through a combination of captured courts and selective policing and strategic distraction, neutralized. There is one more element of Springfield's criminal ecosystem that deserves specific attention: the show's treatment of white-collar crimes. The show is remarkably sophisticated, considering it is a comedy about a cartoon family, in its understanding of how financial crime operates. Burns's most enduring crimes are not dramatic. They are administrative. The power plant violations are safety code violations, which are regulatory matters rather than criminal ones in most jurisdictions. The environmental dumping is classified and prosecuted differently from violent crime. The manipulation of municipal contracts is handled through administrative hearings rather than criminal courts. The capture of regulatory agencies is not technically a crime at all in most of its expressions. Burns has constructed his criminal operation, insofar as it is a criminal operation, to operate almost entirely in the territory between clearly illegal and clearly legal. The violations exist in the spaces where enforcement is discretionary, where the harmed parties lack the resources or the standing to pursue legal remedies, where the cost of prosecution exceeds the political will to undertake it. This is not accidental. It is the architecture of someone who has had over a century to observe how power intersects with law and to position his activities accordingly. Fat Tony's operation is visible and dramatic and occupies the public imagination as the crime story of Springfield. Burns's operation is invisible and administrative and costs the town infinitely more in human terms. The show has understood this for 36 years. It has presented both types of crime with comedic framing that allows the audience to laugh rather than despair. But the information is there, in the accumulated detail of what Springfield's institutions do and do not do, in the gaps between what the law says and what enforcement produces, in the comfortable arrangements between power and the systems supposedly designed to check it. Springfield's criminal underworld is not beneath the town. It is the town, and everyone who lives there, everyone who breathes that air and drinks that water and works at that plant and accepts that their institutions do not function the way they claim to function, is living inside it whether they recognize it or not. The economics of institutional capture. To understand Springfield's criminal ecosystem fully, you have to understand something about how institutional capture actually works in the real world, because the show depicts it with a precision that most explicitly political fiction cannot match. Institutional capture does not happen through dramatic corruption. The popular imagination, trained by decades of crime fiction and political thrillers, pictures capture as a transaction. Money changes hands, a decision changes direction, the institution is bent to a specific will. This happens, it is real, but it is not the primary mechanism of institutional capture in any sustained sense, because it requires continuous transactions and continuous risk of exposure with each transaction. The more durable form of institutional capture is ideological. It happens when the people who populate an institution, not the individual decision-makers who might be bribed or threatened, but the entire body of people who perform the institution's daily functions, come to understand the world in a way that makes the capture's preferred outcomes feel like natural ones. When a regulatory agency comes to believe, through a process of socialization and professional formation and the accumulated influence of the industries they regulate over years of close contact, that the regulated industry's interests and the public interest are fundamentally aligned, you do not need to bribe anyone to produce favorable regulation. The institution produces it automatically, as the natural output of people doing their jobs as they understand their jobs. Springfield's institutions have been operating in this mode for as long as the show has been running. The Springfield Police Department is not corrupt in the narrow sense of officers taking money to look away from specific crimes. It is captured in the broader sense of an institution whose professional culture has been shaped by decades of proximity to the power structure it is supposed to constrain, and whose members have internalized a set of values that consistently produce outcomes favorable to that power structure without any individual having to consciously choose those outcomes. Wagum is not taking money from Burns, but Wagum grew up in Springfield, works in Springfield, lives in Springfield, has his social relationships in Springfield, and has spent his entire professional life receiving feedback from a community that has itself been shaped by Burns's influence over decades. The values that Wagum brings to his work, the judgments he makes about which situations deserve resources and which do not, which complaints deserve investigation and which do not, which laws deserve enforcement and which can be strategically deprioritized, all of these are products of a formation process that Burns's influence over the community shaped without Burns ever having to specifically direct Wagum. This is considerably more difficult to address than straightforward bribery, because it is invisible as corruption. Wagum is not lying when he explains his decisions. He is applying his genuine values and his genuine judgment to his genuine responsibilities and producing outcomes that are genuinely consistent with his understanding of his job. The problem is that his understanding of his job has been shaped by a community whose values have been shaped by the interests of a specific billionaire over decades. The corruption is not in Wagum. It is in the environment that produced Wagum, and the environment that produced Wagum is the environment that Wagum now enforces. This is what Burns's monopoly over Springfield's economy actually produces. Not a town where every official has been bought. A town where every official has been formed by a culture that the monopoly shaped, and that culture now sustains the monopoly's interests through the normal operation of the institutions it inhabits. Fat Tony and the parallel economy. Fat Tony's criminal organization is, in economic terms, a parallel institution. It exists alongside the legitimate economy, serving functions that the legitimate economy either cannot or will not serve, and it does so with a professionalism and consistency that the legitimate economy's own institutions often fail to match. This is not a defense of organized crime. It is an observation about what organized crime looks like when it operates in an environment where the legitimate institutions have been compromised sufficiently that they no longer serve their stated functions. In that environment, the services that institutions nominally provide, contract enforcement, dispute resolution, resource allocation, protection, do not simply go unprovided. They are provided by whatever structure is capable of providing them. And if the legitimate institutions are too compromised to do this, then the illegitimate ones fill the gap. Fat Tony fills gaps. He enforces contracts in contexts where the legal system is too slow or too captured to be useful. He provides credit in contexts where legitimate financial institutions have declined to lend. He offers protection in contexts where the official protection services are, as we have established, focused on other things. He does all of this with a consistency and a professionalism that his clients find reliable, which is why they are his clients. This is not to say that Fat Tony is a good thing for Springfield. He is not. The parallel economy he operates exists at the expense of the legitimate economy, extracts resources from the community through mechanisms that are coercive rather than voluntary, and sustains itself through violence, or the credible threat of violence, in ways that impose real costs on the community. These costs are real and significant, but they are also, from the perspective of the people who bear them, a known quantity. The costs of operating within Fat Tony's economy are predictable and manageable in ways that the costs of operating within an economy dominated by Burns are not. Burns's costs are invisible, distributed, deniable, the kind of costs that the radiation theory describes as operating at the cellular level, affecting the people who bear them in ways they cannot detect or attribute or resist. Fat Tony's costs are visible and explicit, and, paradoxically, that visibility makes them more manageable than the invisible ones. Springfield's residents have made a calculation, not consciously but structurally through the choices their environment has shaped, that the visible costs of the parallel economy are preferable to certain aspects of the invisible costs of the legitimate one. This is not a rational calculation in the formal sense. It is the kind of calculation that populations make when they have been in contact with a specific environment long enough that the environment's costs have been sorted into categories of bearable and unbearable. Fat Tony's operation is bearable. Burns's operation is the water they swim in. You can see the shark. You cannot see the water that is slowly, silently, over decades of exposure, changing the shape of everything that lives inside it. The question of accountability. There is a final dimension of Springfield's criminal ecosystem that the show has engaged with more directly than any other. The question of what it would take to produce genuine accountability for the people who have done the most damage. The show has, in various episodes, depicted scenarios in which genuine accountability seems within reach. The EPA dome is the most extreme example. A federal agency determining that Springfield's contamination is severe enough to require physical containment of the entire town. Within the movie's narrative, this produces a crisis and eventually a resolution, but the resolution involves the Simpsons family preventing the town's destruction rather than the power plant's operators being held responsible for the contamination that made the dome necessary. The accountability that the crisis implies does not materialize. The crisis is resolved. Burns is not prosecuted. The dome is removed. Springfield continues. This pattern, accountability approaching and then not materializing, is one of the most consistent patterns in the show's treatment of Burns and of Springfield's institutional failures more broadly. The approaching accountability is the dramatic engine. The non-materialization is the show's consistent observation about how power actually operates in the real world. It can get very close to accountability and still escape it. because the resources that produce the accountability gap in the first place can also be deployed to prevent the gap from being closed. Burns has money and lawyers and judges and the structural advantages of someone who has spent a century building the kind of relationships that make accountability expensive for the people trying to impose it. The EPA can determine that Springfield is a contamination zone. The EPA cannot, within the show's universe, force a billionaire to stop operating the facility that produced the contamination because the billionaire has already anticipated this and has arranged his legal exposure accordingly. This is the most accurate thing the show has ever depicted about how wealth and power interact with legal accountability. Not that the wealthy are immune to accountability, that they have more resources than anyone trying to hold them accountable, and that the intersection of those asymmetric resources consistently produces the same outcome. The accountability arrives and then does not quite stick, and the operation continues, and the next accountability effort begins from a position no stronger than the previous one. Springfield's criminal underworld is not going anywhere. The conditions that produced it and that sustain it are structural, and structural problems do not yield to individual accountability efforts, however well-organized or well-intentioned. They yield to structural change, and structural change in Springfield is what the floating timeline and the collective denial and the managed amnesia and the billionaire's weekly treatments are specifically designed to prevent. The crimes nobody names. The most significant criminal activity in Springfield is not the activity that Chief Wagum investigates. It is the activity that Wagum's department is structurally incapable of investigating, not because it requires expertise the department lacks, but because investigating it would require the department to turn its attention toward the people whose cooperation the department depends on to function. This is the fundamental paradox of policing in communities where economic power is concentrated. That the regulatory authority available to the police is authority over the behaviors of people who lack the resources to make the exercise of that authority costly, while the people whose behaviors most significantly harm the community have the resources to make investigation expensive, slow, procedurally complicated, and ultimately unresolvable within the institutional and legal frameworks that constrain the police on one side while leaving the targets largely unconstrained on the other. Burns's violations of environmental law, labor law, safety regulation, and basic standards of industrial operation are not secret. They have been documented, inspected, reported, and filed in various government databases across 36 seasons of the show. 342 violations found in a single inspection, an estimated $56 million required to achieve compliance. These are not vague allegations. They are specific findings produced by the regulatory processes that are supposed to produce accountability. And they have produced nothing. No closure, no prosecution, no penalty that Burns could not easily absorb as a cost of operation. The regulatory apparatus has touched the facility repeatedly, and the facility has continued to operate in exactly the condition it was in before the apparatus arrived. This is not because the regulations are insufficient or because the inspection process is flawed. It is because the gap between regulatory finding and regulatory enforcement is precisely the gap that a sufficiently resourced operator can sustain indefinitely by deploying legal resources, by exploiting procedural requirements, by managing the political relationships that influence the regulatory agencies, by ensuring that the cost of enforcement remains higher than the political will available to bear it. Wagum cannot close this gap. It is not within his jurisdiction in the practical sense, even if it is within his jurisdiction in the formal one. The crimes that do the most damage in Springfield are the crimes that the formal jurisdiction of the police cannot reach, and the crimes the police can reach are the ones committed by people who do not have the resources to sustain the gap. Fat Tony gets arrested periodically. He manages these arrests with equanimity because he has budgeted for them, and because the legal system's capacity to hold him accountable in ways that actually disrupt his operation is limited by the same factors that limit its capacity to hold Burns accountable, only at a smaller scale and with less political insulation. He is arrested. He is processed. He resumes. The cycle is part of the operation's normal functioning, not an existential threat to it. Meanwhile, Burns operates continuously, without arrest, without prosecution, without any formal accountability that sticks. The comparison is not a comment on the relative morality of their operations. It is a comment on the relationship between resources and accountability in systems, where resources determine the cost of accountability and the target's resources determine whether the cost can be borne. Springfield's criminal underworld is not separate from this dynamic. It exists within it, as a parallel expression of the same basic relationship between resources and accountability that the legitimate economy's power structure expresses. The difference is that the parallel economy's accountability failures are visible and legible and produce social alarm, while the legitimate economy's accountability failures are invisible and structural and produce social normalization. Both are crimes. One is called crime, the other is called business. The Springfield that could have been. Somewhere in the accumulated implications of the show's 36 seasons, there is a version of Springfield that is worth imagining. Not because it is achievable, or because the show is pointing toward it as a realistic alternative, but because imagining it clarifies what has been prevented. A Springfield without the power plant's leaking radiation would be a Springfield whose people had the cognitive capacity that chronic neurological damage has eroded. It would be a Springfield where the population could make the connections that the radiation has made it difficult to make, could see the patterns that the damage has rendered invisible, could ask the questions that the fog has made it difficult to form. The show implies this version of Springfield through the episode where Homer's crayon is removed and his intelligence is restored. The Springfield that Homer sees with his full cognitive capacity is a Springfield he cannot survive, because it is too clear, too legible, too inescapably real. A Springfield where Burns's biography was not the biography of a man who has spent a century building insulation from accountability would be a Springfield where the people who do the most harm to the community are reachable by the processes that are supposed to reach them. It would be a Springfield where the regulatory process produces outcomes rather than documentation, where the inspections result in closure rather than filing, where the gap between finding and enforcement does not exist as a permanent feature of the institutional landscape. A Springfield where the educational institution produced civic engagement rather than civic performance would be a Springfield where the population could act collectively in response to the conditions their collective environment produces, where the awareness of the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who glows after his weekly treatments could translate into organized political response rather than individual complaint and collective forgetting. None of these Springfields exist. What exists is the Springfield the show depicts, which is the Springfield that the accumulated choices of powerful people and the accumulated passivity of the people who were made too cognitively impaired by those choices to resist them effectively have produced over the course of a century. The show does not say this Springfield is inevitable. It says this Springfield is what you get when you have a Burns and an absence of the conditions that would constrain him. That is not inevitability. It is causation. And causation, unlike inevitability, implies that different causes could produce different outcomes. The Springfield that could have been is not a utopia. It is just a town where the fish have the expected number of eyes, and the children grow up with the full cognitive capacity their biology provides, and the school produces people capable of asking the questions their situation requires. That version is not far away. It is exactly one committed billionaire's worth of accountability away. And in 36 years, that accountability has not arrived. Number Section 4. The Flanders Family Conspiracy. Everything about the Flanders family is a performance. This sounds like a harsh thing to say about a man who is, within the show's moral universe, genuinely trying to be good. And it is not meant as a condemnation. The performance is not cynical. It is not strategic in the way that Burns's performances are strategic, designed to accomplish a specific outcome through the manipulation of a specific audience. Ned Flanders's performance of goodness is sincere. It is genuinely, effortfully, exhaustingly sincere. It is a performance in the theatrical sense rather than the dishonest one. A sustained enactment of a self that was constructed through external intervention and that Ned maintains through constant, invisible labor. We established in the previous material the basic facts of Ned's psychological architecture. The beatnik parents, the lack of discipline, the child who was apparently uncontrollable, the psychiatrist who spent several sessions engaged in what the show describes as behavioral therapy, and what the clinical language of the actual world would describe as something considerably more intrusive. The result of those sessions was a man who cannot express anger, who cannot hold on to resentment, who cannot, when faced with genuine cause for rage, access the rage that the show has established exists at his foundation. But what the show has never fully explored is the generational dimension of this story. Because Ned's parents, the beatniks who brought him to the psychiatrist, made a choice on their son's behalf that permanently altered the architecture of his personality. They did not do this maliciously. The show presents them as genuinely well-meaning people who were out of their depth with a child whose behavior they were ideologically unprepared to address through conventional discipline. They took the path that seemed most immediately effective, which was to let a professional fix the problem, and the professional fixed it in a way that the parents likely did not fully understand at the time, and that Ned certainly did not consent to. The question the show raises but does not answer is, what did Ned know, and when did he know it? At some point in his adult life, Ned must have become aware of what happened to him. The episode in which his psychological history is revealed establishes that Ned was present for the therapy sessions, even if he was a young child. He experienced the sessions. He experienced whatever it was that the psychiatrist did that produced the behavioral change. He lived through the aftermath, through the gradual realization as he grew older that he was different from other people in a specific and identifiable way. That his patience was not natural, that his kindness was not freely chosen, that the goodness he projected was the result of something that was done to him rather than something he arrived at through genuine moral development. How does a person live with that knowledge? The answer the show provides, implicitly, is that they live with it by doubling down, by making the performed virtue so thoroughgoing, so complete, so genuinely internalized that the question of whether it is chosen or conditioned becomes almost academic. Ned is good because he was made to be good, and he has decided, presumably at some point in his adult development, that the goodness is worth keeping even if its origin was not something he consented to. He has taken the cage he was placed in as a child and chosen to call it a home. This is either profoundly tragic or profoundly admirable, and the show has the wisdom to present it as genuinely both at the same time. But here is the conspiracy layer. The family that Ned builds on top of this foundation. Ned's first wife Maud is in many ways a mirror of Ned. She is equally devout, equally wholesome, equally committed to the performance of Christian virtue. The show does not explore Maud's psychological history in anything like the detail it explores Ned's, but the implication of her character is that she comes from a similarly constructed background. Two people who met within the world of devout Christianity and who recognized in each other the same orientation toward life, the same commitments, the same particular flavor of sincerity, would naturally find each other. Their marriage makes sense as the union of two people who share a framework for existence. The children, Rod and Todd, are the next generation of the performance. And this is where the conspiracy element becomes visible, because Rod and Todd are not simply devout children raised in a devout household. They are something more extreme. They are children who appear, across dozens of episodes, to have essentially no emotional life outside of the framework of their religion and the performance of their father's goodness. They do not fight with each other in the way Bart and Lisa fight. They do not rebel against their father in the ways that children across Springfield rebel against their parents. They do not have apparent secrets. They do not appear to experience the normal developmental turbulences of childhood in any recognizable form. When they are frightened, which happens often because Springfield is a terrifying place for a sensitive child, they express their fear through prayer, rather than through the unfiltered emotional expression that characterizes most of the children in the show. On one reading, this is simply the show characterizing them as extremely sheltered children raised in an extremely insular religious environment. That reading is probably correct as far as it goes. But the parallel structure between Ned's psychological history and his children's apparent psychological construction is too consistent to be accidental. Ned was conditioned as a child through professional intervention. Rod and Todd exhibit the results of what appears to be very successful home conditioning. They are sweet, they are gentle, they are helpful, they are completely devoid of the particular quality of chaos that defines children their age in Springfield. They are, in a word that the show applies to them affectionately, but that has edges when you apply pressure to it, perfect. Perfect children are not natural children. Perfect children are the product of enormous effort, sustained over years, by parents who have decided that the production of perfect children is their primary parenting objective. And the question that the show never asks is, what does that effort cost? Not Ned. The cost to Ned of raising his children this way is visible in his exhaustion, in the brittleness that shows when the conditioning fails, in the breakdown episodes that reveal the depth of suppression required to maintain the performance. The question is what it costs Rod and Todd. The show has, in isolated moments, suggested that Rod and Todd carry things they do not express. There is an episode in which Rod and Todd, playing with Bart and Lisa, briefly experience the kind of unstructured play that their normal environment does not provide. And the episode observes, with a lightness that does not fully conceal its weight, that they respond to that experience with a quality of joy that is different from their usual presentation. More chaotic, more alive, less controlled. The implication is that Rod and Todd have inner lives that the performance of perfect Christian childhood does not accommodate. That somewhere beneath the organized goodness, beneath the prayers and the hymns and the unfailing politeness, there are children who are something other than what they have been taught to appear to be. The show never explores this because exploring it would require it to make Rod and Todd into complex characters, and they function primarily as foils to the Simpson children, rather than as characters with their own developmental arcs. But the structural question remains: what happens to children who are raised to perform a specific version of themselves? What happens when the performance and the person inside it are not aligned? And what happens to the next generation, when the children of conditioned people raise their own children? Does the conditioning compound? Does it dilute? Does it eventually, across enough generations, produce something stable and genuine, or does it produce something more fragile than either of its parents? Ned does not know the answer to this because he has not been given the conditions to find out. He lost Maude. He has been raising Rod and Todd alone, in a house next to Homer Simpson, in a town that seems specifically organized to test the limits of his conditioning. And every episode in which he succeeds in maintaining the performance is also an episode in which we can see, if we choose to look, how much it costs him. There is a reading of Ned that makes him the most heroic character in the show. Not heroic in the sense of physical courage or dramatic sacrifice, but in the quieter sense of someone who was given a compromised foundation and has built something genuinely good on top of it through sheer sustained effort. The goodness is not fake simply because it was conditioned into being. A person who works hard enough at kindness long enough eventually makes kindness real, regardless of its origins. Ned may have been made to be good, but he has chosen, in every episode, to stay good. And in Springfield, that choice is not as easy or as common as it should be. The conspiracy, if we can call it that, is the conspiracy of well-meaning people doing things to children that the children cannot consent to and cannot fully understand, and then watching those children spend their lives managing the consequences. It is not a dramatic conspiracy. It is not organized. No one benefits from it in the way that Burns benefits from things. It is simply the accumulated result of love that expressed itself in the wrong direction, of protection that looked too much like control, of a family that tried very hard to be good and built that effort into the bones of every person who came after them. And it is set, like everything else in Springfield, in a loop. Ned will continue performing his goodness. Rod and Todd will continue performing their goodness. And the actual people inside the performance will continue, quietly, to be something more complicated and more human than the performance allows for. The real Flanders family conspiracy is that nobody, including the Flanderses themselves, has ever seen it clearly enough to name it. There is also the question of Ned's relationship with God, which the show has treated with a complexity that it rarely acknowledges. As we noted earlier, God talks to Homer. God does not talk to Ned. Homer's encounters with the divine are casual, even affectionate. God shows up in Homer's dreams, in Homer's visions, in one remarkable episode as a fully rendered conversational partner who engages with Homer as a man he finds genuinely interesting. The relationship between Homer and God, as the show depicts it, has the quality of a fondness between two people who are very different but find each other charming. Ned's relationship with God is entirely one-directional. Ned prays, Ned attends services, Ned reads scripture, Ned structures his entire life around the practice of faith. And God, as far as the show reveals, does not respond. The prayers go out and nothing comes back. The devotion is total and the reciprocity is absent. This could be read as the show making a comment about faith itself, about the one-way nature of religious belief and the courage it takes to maintain devotion in the absence of confirmation. That reading is probably partially correct, but it also fits a pattern that the show has developed across multiple storylines. The idea that in Springfield, effort and virtue are not the currencies that produce reward. The currency that produces reward in Springfield is a particular kind of luck or a particular kind of damage. Homer is lucky in ways that have nothing to do with his virtue, His injuries heal, his disasters resolve. The universe treats him with an absurd generosity that his behavior does not justify. Ned is virtuous in ways that produce nothing except more opportunities for virtue to be tested. The asymmetry is not accidental. It is the show's most persistent moral observation that the distribution of grace in Springfield, and by extension in the America that Springfield represents, has no relationship to the distribution of goodness. God likes Homer. Homer is funny. Homer is chaotic and unreliable, and constantly failing, and constantly recovering, and he keeps showing up even when everything is against him. God, as the show depicts him, seems to find this appealing. Ned is steady and reliable and never fails in his faith, and God, as the show depicts the situation, seems to find this entirely unremarkable. As if devotion that never wavers is less interesting than devotion that has to fight for itself. This is either a dark observation about the nature of the divine or a dark observation about the nature of attention. Either God, within Springfield's theology, genuinely prefers the messy, genuine human struggle to the perfected performance of faith, or God, within Springfield's social logic, is simply another institution that responds to the same dynamics as all the others. Chaos gets noticed, compliance gets ignored, and Ned Flanders has been too compliant for too long to merit the kind of divine intervention that his situation genuinely requires. Ned would not frame it this way. Ned would say that God's silence is itself a form of faith-building, an invitation to deeper trust. He would say that the reward for goodness is the goodness itself. He would find a way to make the asymmetry theologically acceptable, because that is what the conditioning produced. A man who can find theological acceptability in anything. But the rest of us, watching from outside the performance, can see what Ned cannot say, that it is hard to watch a good man get so little in return, that it is hard to see someone work that hard at something that genuinely matters, for that long, in that environment, and receive nothing for it except more work, that the Flanders family, with all its performance and all its effort and all its carefully maintained goodness, is the saddest story in a town full of sad stories. Not because they are bad people, because they are trying so hard to be good ones, and the trying costs everything, and the return is silence. The hidden costs of sustained virtue. There is something the show has never directly depicted that is implied by everything it has shown us about Ned Flanders. The cost of the performance measured in its physical dimension. Ned is physically fit. He is notably, almost absurdly physically fit for a man of his age, maintained in a condition that the show treats as a character trait, a part of the Ned package alongside the verbal tics and the neighborliness. But the specific quality of Ned's physical fitness, its deliberateness, the evident discipline that sustains it, suggests something about the function it serves. Bodies carry what minds cannot process. This is one of the more consistent findings of the field, that examines the relationship between psychological states and physical ones. That emotion which has nowhere to go, which is blocked from normal expression by whatever mechanism is doing the blocking, tends to find physical expression instead. It does not disappear. It is redirected. Ned's rage, which the hurricane episode established exists at a significant level of intensity and which the behavioral modification of his childhood established cannot be expressed through normal channels, has to go somewhere. The physical fitness is one hypothesis for where it goes. The discipline required to maintain the body Ned maintains. The sustained effort, the tolerance for discomfort, the willingness to push past the point where most people would stop, these are not just fitness qualities. They are qualities that match the profile of someone who has learned to channel something powerful into controlled physical exertion because the alternative channels are closed. This is not a diagnosis. It is an observation about a pattern in a fictional character. But the pattern is there, in the show's depiction of Ned's physicality, and it is consistent with the psychological architecture that the episode about his conditioning established. The cage does not simply disappear the thing it contains. It redirects it into forms that do not damage the community's perception of Ned as its model citizen. The maintenance of the performance is not free. Nothing this sustained is free, and the body pays part of the cost. What the children learn. Rod and Todd Flanders are going to grow up. The show will never show us this, because the floating timeline prevents it. But within the logic of the world the show has built, the children who attend Springfield Elementary alongside Bart and Lisa are going to become adults. And the question of what Rod and Todd become when they grow up is one of the most unexplored and potentially most revealing questions in the show's universe. They have been raised with exceptional consistency and exceptional care. Their father has given them everything he knows how to give, which is the specific version of goodness that his own formation made available to him. They have been given a framework for understanding the world that is complete and consistent, and that, within its own terms, makes excellent sense. They have not been given the experience of being wrong, or the experience of their framework being insufficient, or the experience of the world resisting their framework in ways their framework cannot accommodate. The world will eventually resist. The world resists everyone's framework. The question is, what happens to people who have been raised with such thorough and loving consistency that the framework they have been given has never been seriously tested within the environment where it was formed? Some people, when their framework meets genuine resistance for the first time, find that the framework is stronger than the resistance. They have enough depth in what they believe, enough genuine relationship with the values they hold, that the encounter with contradiction strengthens rather than shatters. These are people whose formation, however constructed, produce something real enough to survive the encounter with complexity. Other people, when the framework meets resistance, discover that what they had was the performance of a framework rather than the framework itself. That the smoothness of their presentation of their values was the smoothness of things that had never been fully tested, and the encounter with genuine resistance, when it comes, does not strengthen the framework. It reveals that the framework was load-bearing in a specific way, and that the load it was bearing cannot simply be transferred to something else when the framework fails. The show cannot tell us which of these Rod and Todd are. It will not tell us. But the architectural analysis of the Flanders household suggests a specific concern: that the thoroughness of the formation, its completeness and its consistency and its loving intensity, may have made the framework so total that there is not much self outside it that could sustain the framework's failure. That Rod and Todd, unlike their father, never had the experience of being someone other than who they were formed to be, and that this means they have less to fall back on than Ned does if the framework they were given ever encounters something it cannot process. Ned had the experience of being uncontrollable before he was controlled. He knows at some level that the person inside the cage is different from the cage. This knowledge is painful, and it is also structural. It is the thing that allows him to continue when the performance costs more than he can easily bear, because he knows there is a person underneath the performance who has not been entirely consumed by it. Rod and Todd may not have this. They may have been formed so thoroughly and so early that the distinction between the person and the performance is not available to them in the way it is available to their father. They may be, in the most literal sense, what they appear to be. Not because they have no interior life, but because the interior life they were given is the same as the exterior one, without gap or remainder. If so, they are the most successful product of Ned's formation project and also, potentially, the most vulnerable to the specific kind of breaking that the show associated with Ned himself. Not the breaking that comes from knowing the gap and failing to maintain the bridge across it. The breaking that comes from not knowing the gap exists until it opens unexpectedly, without warning, after a lifetime of smooth surface. Ned broke and recovered. He was prepared, by his own history, for the breaking. Rod and Todd have been prepared for everything except breaking, and Springfield will eventually give them something that requires it: the wider Flanders mystery. There is a dimension of the Flanders situation that extends beyond the family itself and into the broader question of what Springfield does with people whose values genuinely differ from the town's operative values. The show has established that Springfield's operative values are not the values it claims. The town claims to value family and community and safety and honest dealing and all the things that American communities are supposed to value. The town's actual values, as evidenced by what it protects and what it ignores and what it criminalizes and what it rewards, are considerably simpler: comfort, compliance, and the maintenance of the existing arrangement. Within this value system, Ned represents something genuinely disruptive, not because he opposes the system directly, which he does not, but because his goodness, even in its conditioned and constructed form, represents an implicit rebuke to a community that has settled into something considerably less demanding. Springfield's residents are not good people in the sustained, effortful, consistent way that Ned is good. They are ordinary people doing what ordinary people do in environments that do not reward the extraordinary. Ned is extraordinary, in the specific and limited sense of someone who does what most people do not do. He shows up for his neighbors. He provides without being asked. He forgives without being required to. He maintains his values in an environment that does not reinforce them and frequently punishes them. And the community's response to this, over 36 seasons of episodes, is to receive the goodness and not particularly change in response to it. This is the most honest observation the show has ever made about the limits of individual virtue in institutional contexts. Ned's goodness is real and it produces real benefits for the people around him, including and especially Homer. Homer has received more from Ned, in terms of material assistance and genuine support and patient forgiveness, than Homer has ever given back. The exchange is wildly asymmetric, and it has not changed Homer. Homer is not a better person for 3 decades of living next to the most virtuous man in Springfield. He is the same Homer, making the same choices, producing the same disasters, receiving the same patient forgiveness. Individual virtue in the absence of institutional change is like bailing water from a sinking boat. The effort is real. The water removed is real. The boat is still sinking. Ned has been bailing for 36 years. The boat is still the same boat. The structural problem has not changed because one person at one address has been consistently good. This is not an argument against individual virtue. It is an argument for its insufficiency as a complete response to structural problems. Ned is as good as Springfield allows anyone to be and then some. And Springfield is exactly as it was when he started being good. The prayer that goes unanswered. Ned Flanders prays. This is one of the show's most consistently depicted facts about him. He prays in the morning and before meals and before sleep, and in the various moments between these structured observances when something in his day prompts a direct address to the divine. He is more consistent and more sincere in his prayer practice than any other character in Springfield, including the characters who are professionally religious. And within the show's universe, God exists and is responsive. God has spoken to Homer. God has engaged with Homer in conversation, has expressed preferences, has participated in Homer's life in the specific and personal way that the theological tradition Ned belongs to describes as the defining character of the divine relationship with humanity. God in Springfield is available. God picks up the phone. He does not pick up for Ned. This is either the most theologically sophisticated observation the show has ever made, or the most casual cruelty it has ever inflicted on a character, possibly both. The show has never addressed it directly, which is itself a choice. The gap between Ned's devotion and God's apparent responsiveness to Homer is present in the show's universe as an established fact that no character has ever asked the obvious question about. The theological interpretation that is most consistent with the show's treatment of Ned's situation is one that the tradition Ned belongs to would find profoundly uncomfortable. That sincerity is not a sufficient condition for divine engagement. That devotion does not produce the relationship it is oriented toward, and that the drunk who falls asleep in the pew receives the visitation that the faithful man who sits upright through every service does not. This is not the theology Ned was raised in. It is the theology his lived experience has produced, and he has not reconciled them. He is still praying. The prayer practice, sustained in the absence of the response that would justify its continuation, is the most revealing thing about Ned's character that the show has ever depicted. He continues, not because the evidence suggests continuation is reasonable, not because the relationship is producing the outcomes that relationships are supposed to produce. He continues because stopping would require him to admit something about the gap between what he believes and what his experience has shown him, and that admission would be more destabilizing than anything that has happened to him so far, including the hurricane and Maud's death and every other catastrophe the show has visited on him. The prayer is the last stable thing. If the prayer is addressed to nothing, then the framework collapses. And if the framework collapses, the person underneath the framework, the person who was conditioned into the framework by a childhood psychiatrist and who has never lived outside of it as an adult, has nowhere to be. Ned continues to pray not because he is certain of the recipient, but because he cannot afford the cost of the alternative. This is a portrait of faith under conditions of sustained evidence against its premises. The show presents it as background character texture. It is one of the most honest depictions of a specific human situation that mainstream American television has ever produced. The Maud question? There is a question embedded in Ned's situation after Maud's death that the show has circled without quite landing on. What did Ned's marriage to Maud actually provide that his formation alone could not? Maud was not depicted in extensive depth before her death. She was a supporting presence, warm and consistent, a complement to Ned's qualities rather than a contrasting force. They were matched. Their values aligned. Their household operated with the same smooth consistency that their individual presentations suggested. They were, from the outside, the functional version of what the Simpsons household aspires to. Two people organized around the same values, producing an environment that reflected those values, raising children in a context of genuine coherence. What Ned lost when he lost Maud was not primarily a partner in the external sense, a person who shared tasks and responsibilities and the practical dimensions of operating a household. He lost the one person whose presence in his life confirmed that the person he was performing was real. Maud saw Ned, not the performance, not the constructed niceness, not the public-facing version of Ned Flanders that Springfield interacts with. She saw the man who made the performance, the person underneath the cage, and she chose him. She did not choose him despite the cage or in addition to the cage. She chose the person who built the cage, who has lived inside it, who cannot imagine himself outside it, and she saw that person as worth choosing. Without that confirmation, the performance becomes what the show's critics of Ned have always implied it was, a construction without a confirming witness. The niceness is still real in the sense that it produces real effects in the world, but it is no longer confirmed as the expression of a person who is genuinely seen by someone who could have chosen otherwise. It is now maintained by a man who is primarily being watched by his children and his neighbor, and a town that takes his niceness as simply what Ned is, without any of them seeing the specific complexity that Maud saw. This is what widowhood often means at the level of identity rather than grief. The loss of the specific witness who made you real in the way that only being seen by a person who chose you makes you real. Ned's grief is genuine, and the show has honored it with more care than it usually brings to grief. But the show has not quite named what the grief is grief for, which is not only Maud herself but the specific confirmation that her presence provided and that her absence revoked. He prays. He maintains the framework. He performs the niceness for a world that receives it without ever quite providing the confirmation that Maud provided simply by being there. He is still there. The framework holds. And that is both the triumph and the ongoing cost of Ned Flanders. That the framework holds even without the witness, even without the confirmation, even without the response to the prayer, even without the reciprocity that would make the sustained effort feel less like effort and more like living. Number Section 5. Mo Sislak, the man behind the bar. Mo Sislak has the worst bar in Springfield. This is not an opinion. This is a fact that the show establishes through consistent, detailed observation across 36 seasons. The Simpsons universe contains several drinking establishments, including a sports bar and at least one establishment that functions as a nightclub in certain episodes, and every objective measure of the drinking experience places Moe's Tavern at the bottom of the available options. The health code situation is implied to be catastrophic. The drinks are often questionable in origin. The clientele, who are also Moe's only genuine social circle, are the kinds of people who drink at a bar that is objectively worse than the other available options, because the other available options might require them to be slightly more presentable. And yet Moe's Tavern has been a foundational institution in Springfield for the entire run of the show. It is where Homer goes when he needs to think, which he does with variable success. It is where significant conversations happen, where storylines develop, where the social fabric of a certain stratum of Springfield masculinity is continuously rewoven through the ritual of bad beer and worse lighting. Moe's Tavern is, in its way, the beating heart of the show's adult male community, which says something about both the community and the heart. But none of this is the Moe mystery. The Moe mystery is Moe himself, and specifically the extraordinary gap between who Moe presents himself as and what the show has revealed about who he actually is. The presentation is clear. Moe is a bartender. He is bitter, he is resentful, he is prone to self-pity in a way that has become normalized enough within the show's comedy that it functions as a character trait rather than as a symptom. He has a face that the show has, with remarkable consistency and cruelty, established is objectively unattractive to an unusual degree. He is lonely. He is frequently the recipient of prank phone calls from Bart, the joke being that Moe's combination of gullibility and explosive anger makes him a reliable source of comedy when called and asked to locate individuals with names like Seymour Butts or Amanda Hugginkiss. This is the surface. The surface has sustained 36 years of jokes, and it is reliable, and it is funny, and it is not the story. The story is what lives underneath the surface, in the fragments of genuine biography that the show has scattered across dozens of episodes without ever assembling them into a full account. Because when you do assemble them, when you lay out what the show has revealed about Mo Zislak's life in chronological order, what you find is not a sad bartender. What you find is a man with an extraordinary history who has made, or been forced to make, a series of choices that landed him behind the worst bar in Springfield, and who has spent several decades making sure nobody looks at him closely enough to see what he once was. Let us build the biography. Mo was, at some point in his past, a competitive boxer. This is established clearly. He was not an amateur or a local fighter. He was, by the show's account, a genuine contender, someone who operated at a level where his outcomes mattered and his skills were real and his future in the sport was not obviously limited. The show is characteristically vague about the specific timeline, but the general shape is clear. Mo boxed, Mo was good at boxing, and then something happened that ended that phase of his life. The show implies that what happened involved rules violations. Mo's fighting career did not end through normal athletic decline or injury, though those factors may have contributed. It ended through something that required removal from the sport, rather than simply departure from it. The precise nature of the violation is never specified, and the show's vagueness here is characteristic of the way it handles things. It wants the audience to understand without being forced to articulate explicitly. Mo threw a fight, or Mo was involved in throwing a fight, or Mo knew about something that should have been reported and did not report it. The specifics are left open. The outcome is not. Mo is out of boxing, by choice or by force, and he does not talk about it. Before boxing, there is the matter of Mo's childhood, which the show has revealed in pieces that do not fully add up to a coherent account, but that are individually disturbing. Mo was, by all indications, a difficult child from an unstable background. There are references to early experiences that involved not being wanted, not being protected, being in situations that children should not be in. The show does not dwell on this material, because dwelling on it would break the comedy frame in ways that even The Simpsons, with its considerable tolerance for dark material, is not prepared to sustain. But the childhood material matters for understanding the adult Mo, because the adult Mo's particular quality of loneliness is not the kind that comes from isolation. It is the kind that comes from a long history of being unable to connect in ways that stick. Mo knows how to make people laugh. He knows how to make them comfortable. He knows how to be useful, how to serve, how to provide the specific function of barkeeping, which is not really about the drinks, and has everything to do with being the person who is always there, always available, always ready to listen. Mo is good at all of this. What he is not good at is being the person someone chooses to stay for. The prank calls from Bart are, in this context, something more than just a running gag. They are the consistent reminder that the primary relationship Mo has with the outside world is one in which someone is taking advantage of his particular combination of gullibility and explosive emotional response. Bart calls because Mo reliably delivers the comedy of a man who cannot distinguish between sincere inquiry and malicious joke, who will every time take the question seriously, who will every time reach the moment of humiliation with the same freshness of injury as if it has not happened before. This should make Mo pathetic, and in some episodes it does. But in other episodes, the prank call dynamic has an undercurrent that is harder to name. There is something about the regularity of the abuse and the regularity of Mo's response that begins to look, over time, less like victimization and more like participation. Mo knows these calls are coming. He has been receiving them for 36 years. At some point, a person who truly wished to stop receiving them would take steps that would result in the calls stopping. The calls do not stop. And the question that sits beneath the comedy is whether Mo wants them to stop. The prank calls are the only reliable, regular form of contact Mo has with someone outside his immediate regular customer base. Bart calls and Mo answers and something happens, even if that something is humiliation. Something is better than nothing. Something means someone on the other end knows his name and his voice, and his particular quality of reaction. Mo's explosive anger at the end of each call is real, but it is not the entirety of what the calls produce. What they also produce, beneath the anger, is the evidence that Mo exists and matters enough to be worth calling. Mo has had relationships. This is important to acknowledge because the show's comedy around Mo's romantic failures can create the impression that he has never been anything but perpetually and hopelessly alone. The reality, as the show has presented it in occasional storylines, is more complicated. Mo has attracted genuine romantic interest from women who, upon closer examination, are not simply unable to see his surface-level flaws. They see him clearly. They are attracted to what they see clearly. The relationships fail. They fail for reasons that are sometimes externally imposed and sometimes the product of Mo's own behavior. He self-sabotages. He mistrusts good things when they arrive. He has a capacity for genuine warmth that he exercises with the people he cares about and then immediately undermines through the particular kind of anxious overcorrection that comes from a person who has been disappointed enough times that they cannot trust good things to last. Mo's loneliness is not the product of a world that has refused to give him what he needs. It is, at least partly, the product of a man who has refused to let the world give him what he needs because accepting it would mean accepting the possibility of losing it, and losing things at Mo's level of emotional investment is not something he has developed good mechanisms for surviving. Now let us talk about Mo's bar, because the bar is not just a setting, it is the most legible expression of Mo's inner life available in the show's universe. The bar is bad, we establish this, but the bar is bad in specific and interesting ways. The physical environment is consistently depicted as being in a state that should constitute multiple health violations. The lighting is designed to conceal rather than illuminate. The drinks are frequently of uncertain provenance. The furniture is old and maintained to a standard that speaks of someone who has long since stopped expecting anyone to actually care about the environment. And yet the bar is always open. In every single episode in which the bar appears, in every storyline in which Mo is a relevant character, the bar is there and Mo is behind it and the lights are on, such as they are, and the drinks are available, such as they are. The bar does not have good nights and bad nights in the way that actual bars do. It is simply always operational, always present, always a reliable option for Homer and Barney and the other regulars who make up the core of Mo's world. This consistency is not commercially rational. The bar, by every implication of the show, does not do enough business to justify its continued existence as a going concern. Mo has mentioned financial difficulties enough times that the bar's economic viability is a genuine question. He should, by standard business logic, have closed years ago. He has not closed. He will not close. Because the bar is not primarily a business, it is a structure. It is the thing that gives Mo's days a purpose and his existence a shape. As long as the bar is open, Mo is a bartender. As long as he is a bartender, he has a reason to be behind the bar, which is the one place in Springfield where he is unambiguously in his element and unambiguously needed. The moment the bar closes, Mo becomes a man with a past and no present. He becomes the ex-boxer with the difficult childhood and the failed relationships and the talent for connection that never quite succeeded in connecting anything permanent. The bar is not where Mo works. The bar is what Mo is, and keeping it open, at whatever economic cost, is how Mo maintains the story of himself that he finds most bearable. There is a specific episode that crystallizes this. Mo, through circumstances that are appropriately Simpsonian in their improbability, is given an opportunity to transform his establishment into a genuine upscale restaurant. He takes it. The restaurant succeeds. The food is good, the environment is transformed, the clientele upgrades, and for a brief moment Mo has something he has never had before. A business that reflects his actual capabilities rather than his assumed limitations. And then it ends. Through a combination of external circumstances and his own choices, the restaurant fails and the bar returns. The moment of transformation collapses back into the baseline, and Mo is once again behind the bar, once again serving the same drinks to the same regulars, once again the sad bartender with the prank call problem. The episode is structured as a comedy in which a man gets a good thing and loses it through bad luck and mild incompetence. But the undercurrent is something darker. Mo's transformation failed not only because of the external obstacles. It failed because Mo, at some level, does not believe he gets to have the good version. He does not believe the restaurant is the real story. He believes the bar is the real story because the bar matches his internal assessment of what he deserves, and the restaurant, no matter how well it was going, never felt like something he was entitled to sustain. This is the most psychologically precise thing the show has ever said about Mo, and it said it entirely through plot mechanics and visual storytelling, without any of the characters ever articulating it. That is one of the things The Simpsons does at its best. It puts real emotional truth in the gaps between the jokes, and it trusts that some portion of its audience will find it there. Mo Sizlak is a man with an extraordinary hidden history who has built a life as small as he could make it and then defended that smallness against every attempt to expand it. The prank calls are part of the smallness. The bad bar is part of the smallness. The failed relationships are part of the smallness. Everything that makes Mo pathetic is also, from another angle, everything that makes him safe. Safe from the expectation of more. Safe from the possibility of getting something good and then having it taken away. Safe inside a life that has been so thoroughly stripped of genuine possibility that there is nothing left to lose. The tragedy of Mo is that he is not trapped by Springfield. He is not trapped by circumstance. He is trapped by his own accurate assessment of what Springfield will do to people who want too much. He has watched Homer want things and suffer for wanting them. He has watched Burns have everything and use it to destroy everyone around him. He has calculated, somewhere below articulation, that the safest possible position is the one with the lowest exposure. Behind the bar, in the bad light. Answering the phone when it rings even though he knows who it is. Because at least when the phone rings, someone is on the other end. And in Mo's world, that is as close to connection as he has learned to expect. The bar as Springfield's emotional infrastructure. Mo's Tavern serves a function in Springfield's social ecosystem that no other institution in the town provides. And the specificity of that function is worth understanding before you can understand why the bar is the way it is and why Mo is the way he is. Every town has informal gathering places where the social fabric is maintained through conversation and proximity and the sharing of time without specific purpose. Barbershops, diners, parks. The informal gathering place is where community actually happens, not in civic meetings or official events, but in the unstructured accumulation of small interactions between people who share a geography. These places are not efficient. They do not produce outcomes that can be measured or managed. They produce something more diffuse and more essential. The experience of being known, of being a recognizable presence in a specifically human community, of having a place that acknowledges your existence without requiring anything from it. Mo's Tavern is this for a specific stratum of Springfield's adult male population. It is the place where Homer and Barney and Lenny and Carl and the other regulars exist as themselves, without the roles their other contexts assign to them. Homer at the plant is the safety inspector, inadequate and perpetually at risk. Homer at home is the father and husband, loving and chaotic and frequently failing at the requirements of both roles. Homer at Mo's is just Homer. The bar does not require him to perform any version of himself except the one that wants a beer and conversation, and the specific comfort of a place that knows your name, even when you do not always deserve to have it known. This is not a small thing. In a town where every institution has an agenda, where the school socializes and the plant exploits, and the courts maintain order, and the church produces virtue, and the mob enforces its contracts, Mo's Tavern has no agenda. It does not want anything from the people who come to it. It wants their money, in the technical business sense. But Mo's relationship with the financial dimension of his enterprise is, as we have established, thoroughly complicated by his willingness to extend credit indefinitely to people who do not repay it. The bar does not optimize for revenue, it provides a space. That space is what Springfield's social infrastructure cannot otherwise produce. A place without agenda, where people can be present without being managed, where the conversation does not serve any purpose beyond the conversation. This is the function that the bad lighting and the bad beer and the bad everything else actually serve. They are the guarantors of the space's uselessness for any purpose except presence. Nobody comes to Mo's to conduct business or to improve themselves or to participate in any process that would produce a measurable outcome. They come because it is there and it receives them and asks nothing. Mo, behind the bar, is the human expression of this function. He is present without agenda. He listens without purpose. He receives whatever the person across the bar brings and does not sort it into categories of useful and not useful. He simply receives it. This is the specific gift that his biography has made him capable of providing and that Springfield's economy has placed him in a position to provide. The unconditional attention of someone who has nothing to gain from the attention but provides it anyway. The tragedy and the gift. The tragedy of Mo Sizlak and the gift of Moe Szyslak are not separable. They are the same thing seen from two different angles. The same formation that produced his loneliness produced his capacity for witness. The same history that made him unable to sustain the intimate relationships he wants made him available for the unconditional presence that his regulars need. The wound and the gift are the same wound. This is not unusual. Many of the most genuinely useful things that people do for others are made possible by the specific ways their lives did not work. The therapist whose effectiveness comes from having navigated their own version of what their clients face. The teacher whose patience with struggling students comes from having been one. The bartender whose capacity for unconditional presence comes from having wanted that presence himself and never quite been able to sustain it in the forms he most wanted. Moe wanted to sustain intimacy. He has not been able to. The gap between what he wanted and what he has been able to achieve has made him exceptionally skilled at providing the thing one level below what he was aiming for. Not intimacy, which requires mutuality and sustained presence over time. Presence, which requires only showing up and receiving and not requiring the person across from you to be anything in particular. He shows up. He receives. He does not require anything in particular. This is, as it turns out, exactly what Homer Simpson needs. Not intimacy, which Homer has with Marge in his specific and chaotic way. Not friendship, exactly, which requires a mutuality that Homer's cognitive situation makes difficult to sustain consistently. What Homer needs is a place where he can be received without agenda, where the conversation is possible without stakes, where the worst version of himself is not going to produce consequences that follow him home. Moe provides this. The bad bar and the bad beer and the presence behind the counter that is always there. Homer goes to Moe's when the world is too much, and Moe is always there, and the bar is always open, and the beer is always available, and something about this specific constellation of reliable, non-demanding, non-evaluating presence is genuinely sustaining. This is Moe's contribution to the world, and it is real, even if it is not the contribution Moe imagined for himself when he was young and boxing, and had not yet understood that the specific gifts his life would develop in him were not the gifts he had planned to develop. He planned to be a champion. He became a witness. The champion's gifts would have served Moe. The witness's gifts serve everyone who walks through the door of a bar that by every objective measure they should not choose and that they choose every time anyway, because Moe is behind the counter and the light is forgiving, and nobody is asking them to be better than they are tonight. That is, in its way, a kind of championship. The prank calls revisited. We noted earlier that the prank calls from Bart reveal something important about Moe's character through the consistent failure of self-protection they display. But there is another dimension of the prank calls that rewards attention. What they reveal about Bart's relationship with Moe. Bart calls Moe. He has been calling Moe for 36 years. The calls are always structured the same way. Bart asks for a fictitiously named person. Moe calls the name. The name is revealed to be a joke. The joke humiliates Moe. Moe is furious. The comedy is produced. This is the transaction. But the transaction has a relational dimension that the comedy framing tends to obscure. Bart calls Moe specifically. Not another bar, not a random business, Moe's Tavern. In 36 years of calling, Bart has not run out of reasons to call the same number and repeat the same basic structure with infinite variation. And Moe, in 36 years of receiving these calls, has not changed his number or refused to answer or taken any of the steps that would end the calls. There is, in the relationship between caller and receiver, something more complex than the comedy of a child outsmarting an easily fooled adult. Bart calls Moe because Moe's response is predictable and reliable and producible on demand. In a childhood organized around adults who do not reliably do what he expects them to do, whose responses to his behavior range from punishment to negotiation to exasperation to occasional genuine connection, Moe is one of the few adults in Bart's world whose behavior can be produced with certainty through a specific action. Moe will always call the name. Moe will always reach the humiliation. Moe will always respond with the furious explosion. This is guaranteed. It can be depended upon. In a life that is not always dependable, this specific, reliable, producible reaction is a form of control. Bart can make something happen. He can make Moe happen, specifically, predictably, whenever he wants. This is not a flattering reading of why Bart makes the calls, but it is probably an accurate one. The comedy of the calls, the genuine wit of the names Bart invents is real. But underneath the comedy is the specific pleasure of reliable control, of having a lever that produces a consistent output in a world where many of the levers available to a 10-year-old produce unpredictable results. And Mo answers every time. Because Mo answers the phone, and the phone might be anyone, and the moment before you know who it is a moment where anything is possible. That specific moment, brief as it is worth the cost of what comes after. The night the bar was gone. There is an episode the show has produced, more than once in different forms, that is one of its most quietly devastating. The episode where Moe's tavern closes, or is replaced, or is threatened, and the regulars are displaced into a Springfield that does not have a Moe's in it. These episodes are played primarily for comedy. The regulars are fish out of water in whatever alternative drinking establishment they are forced into. The alternatives fail to provide what Moe's provides. The bar is eventually restored. The joke is that of course it is restored, because Moe's has to exist, because Springfield without Moe's is not Springfield. But the specific quality of the regulars' displacement in these episodes, the way they occupy the alternative spaces without quite fitting into them, is worth attention beyond the comedy it produces. They are not simply uncomfortable with change, the way people are when familiar routines are disrupted. They are specifically unable to be themselves in the alternative contexts. The specific version of Homer that exists at Moe's does not exist in the upscale wine bar or the franchise chain or whatever the episode's alternative is. The identity that the bar allows is specific to the bar. Remove the bar and the identity has nowhere to be. This is not unusual. Particular places produce particular versions of people, and the loss of those places is the loss of the access to those versions that only those places provide. The bar does not just provide a space. It provides the specific conditions under which certain dimensions of a person's identity are available to themselves and to others. Remove the conditions and those dimensions are not exactly lost, but they are inaccessible. The person still exists. The version of the person that the bar allowed exists only in the bar. Mo built this, not consciously, not as a design goal, but through the accumulated effect of the choices he has made about what kind of establishment to run and how to run it. The bad lighting is a choice. The extension of unpayable credit is a choice. The presence behind the bar at all hours is a choice. The specific low-key welcome that the regulars receive, which is different from the welcome of a bar that is trying to maximize its appeal to the broadest possible customer base, is a choice. All of these choices together have produced a specific environment that produces specific versions of the people who inhabit it. Mo made a bar that people could be themselves in. This is rarer than the comedy suggests. Most commercial establishments optimize for something other than the specific selfhood of their customers. Moe's optimizes for exactly this, not because Mo has thought it through as a design principle, but because the bar is an extension of what Mo himself most needs, a place where presence is its own justification, where you do not need to be anything in particular to belong, where the specificity of who you are is received without evaluation. He made what he needed, and other people found that they needed it too. And the bar became the thing it is, not a commercial enterprise in any normal sense, but a community resource that happens to be housed in a commercial structure, and to involve the exchange of money for beer, but whose actual function exceeds both the commerce and the beer by a considerable margin. The friends he keeps waiting for. Moe's relationship with his regulars exists in a specific and slightly unusual register. It is more than the relationship between a bartender and his customers. It is not quite friendship in the sense that the people across the bar from Mo would describe each other as friends. It is something in between, a sustained, accumulated daily presence that has the texture of friendship without fully having its substance. Homer does not think about Mo when Homer is not at Mo's. This is not a criticism of Homer. Homer does not reliably think about most people when those people are not immediately present. Homer's cognitive situation produces a relationship with time and with other people that is organized around immediacy in ways that make sustained reflection on absent people unusual. When Homer is at the bar, Mo is real to him. When Homer leaves the bar, Mo recedes into the category of things that exist but are not currently present, which for Homer is approximately the category of things that do not require attention. Mo knows this. He has known it for long enough that he is not surprised by it. The regulars arrive and Mo is genuinely glad to see them, and the gladness is returned in the specific form that the regulars are capable of returning it, which is genuine in the moment and not sustained beyond the moment. This is the relationship Mo has. It is not the relationship Mo wants. He wants something with more continuity, more reciprocity, more of the sustained mutual awareness that constitutes the difference between someone who shows up at your bar and someone who thinks about you when you are not in the same room. He has never had that. The boxing career ended before it produced the relationships that sustained professional success might have produced. The romantic relationships he has attempted have all failed in ways that confirm his fear that the version of himself he brings to intimacy is somehow wrong for the purpose. The bar has given him proximity to the texture of friendship without the substance, and he has learned to receive this as what is available while continuing, in the background, to want what is not available. This is a patient and very quiet loneliness. Not the acute loneliness of sudden isolation, the chronic loneliness of someone who is surrounded by people and who knows, every day, that the surrounding is not quite the same thing as being known. Mo is surrounded. He tends bar for hours every day and is never alone in the physical sense, and is always in the specific sense that matters most to him, alone in the bar that he built to provide the thing he needs, and that he cannot quite provide to himself. He answers the phone. That is the whole of it, really. He answers the phone every time it rings, because it might be anyone. It might be someone calling to say the thing that would make the difference. It might be the call that is different from all the other calls. He picks up every time because the moment before you know who it is the best moment, and Mo has learned to live in that moment because it is the one that still contains the possibility of anything. Number. Section 6. The Springfield Elementary Cover-Up. Springfield Elementary School is failing its students. This is established so early and so consistently in the show's run that it has achieved the status of background fact, accepted without examination, in the same way that the residents of Springfield accept the power plant's existence or the police's ineffectiveness. The school is underfunded. The teachers are overworked. The facilities are inadequate. The curriculum is compromised. Principal Skinner, whether the real one or the impersonator, administers the school with a combination of genuine effort and systematic defeat that results in outcomes nobody is satisfied with, but nobody is actively trying to change. But underneath the visible failure of Springfield Elementary as a school, there is a more specific and more troubling story. The school is not simply failing to educate its students. It is failing its students in ways that are consistent, directional, and in certain cases so specifically targeted at particular outcomes that the word failure begins to feel imprecise. Springfield Elementary is not failing. It is succeeding at something other than education. Let us build this case from the evidence available in the show's canon. The first and most important piece of evidence is the treatment of Bart Simpson, specifically the show's extended depiction of how the school handles a student who presents as academically disruptive and socially challenging. Bart is a behavioral problem. He is also, as several episodes have established, considerably more intelligent than his grades and his behavior suggest. The Crayon in the Brain episode establishes that Bart's cognitive potential, absent the specific impairment of that particular piece of school stationery in a location where it should not be, is substantially higher than his academic performance indicates. Before the Crayon, Bart presumably had a different relationship with his own capabilities. The school's response to Bart across 36 seasons is a consistent pattern: containment rather than development. The goal, as expressed through the actions of teachers and administrators, is not to help Bart realize his potential. It is to keep Bart's disruptions at a manageable level while moving him through the grade structure in a way that minimizes institutional friction. He is threatened with retention. He is sent to remedial programs. He is assigned to the class of a teacher, Mrs. Crabapple, who has her own complicated relationship with professional disillusionment. Mrs. Crabapple is, alongside Principal Skinner, the most visible face of the school's instruction. And Mrs. Crabapple is, in a way that the show has explored with genuine sympathy, a person who once had professional ideals and has had them systematically ground down by decades of under-resourcing, administrative indifference, and a student population that includes Bart Simpson. She smokes in the classroom. She grades papers with a level of investment that her expressions make clear is minimal. She has developed a distance from her work that functions as a protective mechanism against the full weight of what she was not given the tools to accomplish. Mrs. Crabapple is not a bad teacher. She is a demoralized teacher, which is a very different thing and in some ways a more devastating one. A bad teacher was never good. A demoralized teacher was once something, believed in something, wanted to produce something, and then found herself in an environment that made producing that something impossible and eventually stopped trying. The resignation in her face during classroom scenes is not the resignation of someone who never cared. It is the resignation of someone who cared very much and learned, over years, that caring was not the relevant variable. The question the show has never asked directly is, what produced Mrs. Krabappel's demoralization? What was the specific mechanism? What does Springfield Elementary's institutional environment do to a teacher who arrives with genuine professional enthusiasm? And what does it look like when that environment has had 20 years to complete its work? The answer is visible in the structure of the school's incentives. Springfield Elementary is funded through a combination of local taxes and state allocations, both of which are inadequate in ways that the show establishes are chronic rather than temporary. The school has been underfunded for as long as anyone involved with it can remember. The funding inadequacy is not a crisis. It is a condition, and a condition that has persisted for decades is not a problem to be solved. It is a design. Burns's relationship to Springfield Elementary is worth examining here. Burns's facility poisons the environment and therefore produces the cognitive impairment that makes effective education more difficult. Burns's economic dominance over Springfield means that the tax base, which funds the school, is subject to his preferences and his capacity to manage political outcomes in directions favorable to himself. Burns has, in various episodes, intervened directly in the school's operations when it served his purposes, either by providing resources that came with strings attached, or by withdrawing support in ways that created pressure on the school to accommodate his preferences. The school that emerges from this environment, the school that operates under consistent resource constraint, under the shadow of a population with radiation-related cognitive challenges, under the political influence of a man whose primary interest in the next generation of Springfield residents is that they be compliant enough to work in his plant, is not a school that is organized around the development of critical thinking. It is a school that is organized around the management of the existing conditions, which means managing children rather than developing them. This management approach has specific and identifiable effects on specific students. Lisa Simpson is the most visible case. Lisa is, by the show's own repeated attestation, a genius. She is perhaps the most cognitively capable person in Springfield, and she attends Springfield Elementary. Her experience there is a sustained exercise in frustration and accommodation. The school does not know what to do with a student who operates at Lisa's level. It lacks the resources to provide genuine enrichment. It lacks teachers who are operating at the level required to engage Lisa's actual capabilities rather than her grade-level performance. What it has is a curriculum designed for the average Springfield student and a bureaucracy designed to process students through that curriculum as efficiently as possible. Lisa's intelligence is not an asset to Springfield Elementary. It is a problem. It is the kind of problem that manifests as a student who asks too many questions, who points out when the curriculum is incomplete or incorrect, who demonstrates every day by her mere presence that the school's actual outcomes are not matching its stated goals. And the school's response to this problem is to try to manage it in the same way it manages Bart's disruptions, by containing it rather than developing it. The difference is that Bart's containment looks like punishment, and Lisa's looks like praise. Lisa gets gold stars and academic recognition, and the occasional nod of approval from the few teachers who genuinely see her. But what she does not get is an education commensurate with her capabilities, which means the gold stars function primarily as a way of making her feel seen without actually doing anything about the gap between what she could learn and what the school is prepared to teach her. There is an episode in which Lisa is assigned to a class for gifted children, and the relief she experiences in that environment, the sense of finally being surrounded by people operating at something approaching her level, is palpable and genuine. And then the program is cut, the resources are redirected, Lisa returns to the regular classroom, and the cycle resumes. This is the pattern. The school acknowledges Lisa's gifts occasionally, creates a space that serves her briefly, and then withdraws the space when the resource calculus makes sustaining it inconvenient. Lisa learns, from this, not that her intelligence is valued, but that its value is conditional and temporary and subject to institutional priorities that have nothing to do with her actual development. The lesson Lisa is learning from Springfield Elementary is not the curriculum. The lesson is, institutions will acknowledge you when it is easy and withdraw that acknowledgement when it becomes difficult. and the appropriate response is to manage your expectations accordingly. This is not the lesson that produces confident, innovative, engaged citizens. It is the lesson that produces people who understand their place within an existing order and do not push against that order because they have learned, through repeated experience, that pushing does not produce sustained results. In other words, it is the lesson that produces the kind of population that Burns needs. The Principal Skinner situation, which we explored in a previous section, gains additional significance in the context of the school's broader institutional function. The man who administers Springfield Elementary is a man who is not who he says he is, who has been living inside a stolen identity for decades, who maintains his position through a combination of community acceptance of the lie and a legal decree making the truth illegal. This is the man who runs the school. What does it mean for an educational institution's culture when its leader is someone living in fundamental dishonesty? The culture of a school is set by its leadership. The values that percolate through an institution from the top are the values that shape how teachers treat students, how administrators handle problems, how the institution as a whole positions itself in relation to truth and accountability. Principal Skinner, whatever his personal qualities and genuine efforts in the role, is a man who has made peace with existing inside a fiction. He has decided that the fiction is preferable to the truth, that the life he has built inside the stolen identity is worth protecting regardless of the cost to the person whose identity was stolen. This is the man who sets the tone for Springfield Elementary's institutional culture. Is it any wonder that the school has, over time, developed an institutional culture in which uncomfortable truths are managed rather than addressed, in which the gap between stated mission and actual outcome is papered over with the same collective agreement to maintain the comfortable fiction that governs the principal's own existence? The school does not teach children, it socializes them. It prepares them to participate in the Springfield consensus, the agreement to normalize the abnormal, to accept the unacceptable, to look at a three-eyed fish and a glowing billionaire, and an imposter principal, and a non-aging family, and a nuclear plant with 342 safety violations and conclude that everything is probably fine. This is not education, this is initiation, and Springfield Elementary is where the initiation begins. There are specific moments in the show's history where the schools function as an instrument of social reproduction rather than genuine development becomes explicit. The episode in which Bart cheats his way onto a quiz team, and then the school abandons any pretense of academic standards when it becomes inconvenient to maintain them. The episode in which a new superintendent arrives with genuine reform intentions and is immediately confronted with the full weight of the institutional resistance to anything that would require actual change. The episode in which the school's library is found to contain books that are not only out of date, but in some cases factually incorrect, in ways that nobody has noticed for years. Each of these moments is comedic in its presentation. Each of them is, underneath the comedy, an accurate description of how an institution designed to serve the existing social order rather than the genuine development of its students actually operates. It is not dramatic. It is not conspiratorial in the traditional sense. It is simply the accumulated result of decades of institutional drift in a direction that serves the wrong people. And the teachers who remain, the ones like Mrs. Krabappel who have stayed despite everything, are not villains. They are survivors. They have adapted to the conditions of the institution in ways that allow them to continue showing up, and showing up is not nothing. Showing up and being present in a room with 25 children every day, even imperfectly, even under the weight of accumulated disillusionment, is still a form of service. But it is not enough, and Springfield Elementary, as the show has depicted it across 36 seasons, has never been enough. The children of Springfield deserve better than what they have been given. And the tragedy is that they do not know it, because the school that has failed them has also ensured, through its own particular form of socialization, that they do not have the tools to recognize what better would look like. The teachers the school produces. There is a specific category of person that Springfield Elementary, through its institutional operation over decades, has systematically produced and then lost. The teacher who came in with genuine ambition for their students and left, or stayed in ways that cost them something essential because the institution could not accommodate the ambition. The show has depicted these people peripherally. The substitute teacher who briefly engaged Lisa's genuine enthusiasm. The athletic coach who had one season of genuine connection with students before the institutional pressures reasserted themselves. The science teacher who, for a brief period in one episode's narrative, brought genuine rigor to a curriculum that was not organized around rigor. Each of these figures appears and then disappears, either removed or reduced, and the school returns to its baseline. This pattern is not accidental in any institution. It is the product of organizational culture, specifically of the mechanisms through which institutions that have stable, established cultures deal with people who represent a different set of values. The mechanism is not dramatic. It does not involve explicit confrontation or formal reprimand in most cases. It involves the slow, patient application of institutional pressure in the forms that are most deniable: the assignment of difficult classes, the withdrawal of administrative support, the quiet signals that the aspirations a person brought to the role are not going to be realized in this environment, and that the choice to continue aspiring will come at increasing personal cost. Most people, after receiving these signals long enough, make an accommodation. Not a dramatic compromise where they formally agree to stop caring about what they care about. A quiet one, a gradual reduction in the scope of their ambition, an adjustment in what they expect from themselves and their students, a narrowing of the distance they travel in a day from the institutional baseline. Over years, these accommodations accumulate. The person who was once something else becomes what the institution needs them to be, not because they chose this, but because they did not choose, consistently and actively, against it. Mrs. Krabappel is the portrait of this process completed. The teacher who arrived with something and was processed by the institution across years until what remained was the minimum expression of what she had been. She has not entirely lost what she came with. The care is still there, in its defended and ironized form, but the expression of it has been reduced to what the institution can absorb without being required to change, and what the institution can absorb without being required to change is considerably less than what Bart Simpson needs. The students of Springfield Elementary are not poorly served by teachers who do not care. They are poorly served by teachers who care too much to leave and not enough to fight effectively, who have settled into the specific, painful middle ground of people who remain in positions they can no longer fully inhabit because the alternative, leaving, seems like a larger defeat than staying. This is the institution's most effective mechanism for containing its teachers, making staying feel less like surrender than leaving, making the accumulated investment, the years of effort and the relationships, and the specific familiarity with the community feel like collateral that leaving would sacrifice. Teachers who cannot leave are teachers whose remaining caring can be absorbed and redirected without producing genuine change, and the institution benefits from having their presence without having to respond to their values. The students the school produces. On the student side, the outcomes are even more specifically legible than on the teacher side, because the show has given us a sustained view of what Springfield Elementary's products look like. The adults of Springfield who were once Springfield Elementary students are now the voters, and the workers and the business owners and the civic participants who sustain the system the school was designed to sustain. They are people who have absorbed, through their educational formation, the values that the institution imparted, the normalization of the abnormal, the accommodation of institutional failure, the specific quality of political passivity that allows a man like Burns to operate without sustained civic challenge. They are not bad people. Lenny and Carl, who are among the show's most consistently sympathetic adult characters, are products of Springfield's educational system. They are good-natured and loyal and genuinely kind within the specific interpersonal contexts where they have relationships. What they are not is politically engaged in any way that would produce challenge to the institutional arrangements that produce their conditions. They work at the plant. They see the violations. They absorb the radiation in the metaphorical and possibly literal sense. They do not organize. They do not protest. They do not demand accountability. This is not because they are incapable. It is because nothing in their formation produced the specific combination of civic expectation, institutional understanding, and collective efficacy that political organization requires. The school that formed them did not teach civic engagement. It taught civic performance, the gestures of democratic participation, the voting and the town hall attendance, without the substantive orientation toward accountability that would make these gestures consequential. This distinction is the most important thing Springfield Elementary produces in its students, and it is the thing that is most essential to the functioning of Burns's Springfield. A population that participates in the forms of democracy without the substance of democratic agency is a population that provides cover for an unaccountable power structure while never successfully challenging it. They vote. The vote does not change things. They attend town meetings. The town meetings do not produce accountability. They go through the motions of self-governance, and the outcomes remain what they were before the motions began. And the school that produced this population is the school that was administered by a man who was not who he said he was, staffed by teachers who once had ambitions the institution could not sustain, resourced at a level that made genuine educational excellence impossible, and situated within a community that the most powerful person in town had every incentive to keep cognitively and politically passive. This is not conspiracy, it is design. The design of Springfield Elementary is the design of every institution that produces the outcomes it produces, without anyone having to consciously choose those outcomes, because the outcomes are the natural product of the conditions the institution operates in and the values those conditions produce in the people who inhabit it. The school is exactly what Springfield needs it to be. The question that the school cannot ask, and that its students cannot ask, and that the show has been asking quietly for 36 years is, what do the students need it to be? The answer is something so different from what it currently is that the gap between them is itself the most accurate measurement of how thoroughly Burns's Springfield has subordinated the interests of its population to the interests of its power structure. What Lisa already knows. There is a dimension of Lisa Simpson's relationship with Springfield Elementary that the show has been consistently honest about without quite making it the explicit subject of any episode. That Lisa knows exactly what the school is doing and has known for a long time. She knows that the gold stars are not an accurate measure of the quality of her thinking. She knows that the enrichment programs are not organized around enrichment in any meaningful sense. She knows that the gap between what she needs from an educational institution and what Springfield Elementary provides is not a gap that can be bridged by her own effort, because the limitation is structural and her effort, however exceptional, cannot compensate for structural limitation from the inside. This knowledge is what separates Lisa from Bart in their relationship with the school, not their intelligence or their ambition. Bart does not understand what the school is doing. He experiences it as a system that produces specific outcomes for him, primarily negative ones, and he responds with the resistance that those outcomes naturally produce. His resistance is real, and some of it is genuinely principled, but it is not organized around a clear analysis of the institution's actual function. He is reacting. Lisa is analyzing. The analysis has produced a specific form of suffering that Bart does not experience in the same way. The suffering of someone who sees clearly what is happening to them and cannot change it. Bart cannot see clearly, so his suffering is the suffering of someone who is treated badly without understanding why. Lisa sees clearly, so her suffering is the suffering of someone who understands exactly why she is being treated the way she is being treated, and who has to live inside that understanding without a way out of the situation it describes. This is a specific and particularly difficult form of suffering, and the show has been honest about it in the episodes that engage with Lisa's interior life most directly. She is not simply a smart kid in a school that doesn't challenge her enough. She is a person who has seen the mechanism that produces her situation and who has to go to that school every day and sit in those chairs and receive those gold stars and pretend that the experience of receiving them is something other than what she knows it is. The show has given her music as the alternative space where her genuine capacities find genuine expression, where the evaluation is not mediated by an institution that has other interests. When Lisa plays her saxophone, she is not performing for an audience that has decided what the performance should be before she begins. She is producing something specific to her, in real time, and the quality of what she produces is accessible on its own terms rather than in relation to what the institution wants to see produced. This is why the saxophone matters as much as the show has always suggested it matters. It is not simply a character attribute or a comedy contrast with Bart's disorder. It is the space in which Lisa exists as what she actually is rather than as what the institution processes her as. The saxophone is the anti-school, the place where Lisa's specific intelligence finds specific expression without the institution's mediating and limiting presence. And she has to put it down at the end of the music and go back to the school on Monday morning and sit in Mrs. Krabappel's class and receive the gold stars every week, every year. Because the loop does not release her any more than it releases anyone else, and in Springfield, even the smartest person in the room cannot think her way out of the room. The archive of complaints. One of the most consistent and least remarked features of Springfield Elementary's depiction across the show's run is the existence of a record. Not a formal institutional record, but the accumulated evidence visible across seasons. The number of times the school has been brought evidence of its failures and has processed that evidence without changing. Parents have complained. Lisa has formally protested. Teachers have indicated the inadequacy of their resources. Health inspectors have found violations in the cafeteria. The district has been presented with evidence of the school's underperformance on standardized metrics. All of this has been processed. Some of it has produced specific episodes of attempted reform that the show then depicts failing or being reversed. None of it has produced durable structural change. This accumulation of processed but unheeded evidence is the most accurate depiction the show offers of how institutional dysfunction sustains itself in the face of evidence of its own inadequacy. The institution does not ignore the evidence. Ignoring evidence is too visible and too contestable. It processes the evidence. It acknowledges the concerns. It forms committees and produces reports and implements pilot programs and evaluates outcomes and then returns to its baseline when the evaluative attention passes and the pressure that produced the acknowledgement is withdrawn. The evidence is always there. The complaints are filed. The concerns are heard. The institution continues unchanged because the processing of concerns is not the same thing as being changed by them, and Springfield Elementary has become very good at processing concerns without being changed by them. This is institutional resilience in the non-laudatory sense. The capacity of a dysfunctional institution to sustain its dysfunction in the face of evidence and pressure by absorbing the evidence and the pressure through mechanisms that prevent them from producing the changes they would produce if the institution were organized to respond to its actual function rather than to its survival. The school survives. The students within it get what the school can provide, which is less than what they need and more than nothing. And they carry the gap between these quantities into the rest of their lives, where it compounds in the specific ways that insufficient formation compounds over time. The archive of complaints grows. The school continues. And every September, new children who are about to learn how the institution works walk through the front door for the first time, and the institution receives them with the specific low-level welcome of a place that has been receiving people for a very long time and has learned to do so without being particularly changed by the receiving. Number. Section 7. Krusty the Clown's Double Life. Krusty the Clown is a fraud. This is one of the foundational truths of the Simpsons universe, stated early and reinforced constantly across the show's entire run. Krusty's comedy is not comedy. It is the performance of comedy executed with professional competence in service of commercial objectives that have nothing to do with making children laugh and everything to do with making money. From the fact that children are made to laugh by the performance of comedy. This is a distinction the show understands and cares about. The Simpsons has always been alert to the difference between authentic creative work and the industrialized production of entertainment product. And Krusty, from his earliest appearances, embodies the industrialized version. His name on something means it was licensed, not that it was made. His face on a product means the product is trying to purchase the emotional association children have with the face, not that Krusty selected the product because he believed in its quality. Krusty's endorsement is a mechanism for extracting money from the loyalty children feel toward a fictional character, and Krusty knows this and participates in it with an enthusiasm that the show has consistently depicted as both commercially rational and morally hollow. But the fraud that defines Krusty's public existence is not the most interesting fraud in his biography. The most interesting fraud is the one that operates at the level of his personal history, his family, his identity, and his relationship with the community that made him famous. Krusty's real name is Herschel Shmoykel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustofsky. He is Jewish. He is the son of Rabbi Hyman Krustofsky, one of the most respected figures in Springfield's Jewish community. He grew up in a household defined by religious observance, cultural identity, and the expectations that come with being the son of a prominent community leader. And he became a clown. This sounds like the setup to a joke, and in many of its presentations it is. But the underlying story, the one the show has explored in its most emotionally sustained episodes, is not comedic in any straightforward sense. It is a story about a son who could not be what his father needed him to be, and a father who could not accept what his son needed to become, and the decades of estrangement that resulted from both of them being partially right and fully unable to reconcile those partial rightnesses into a livable arrangement. Rabbi Krustovsky wanted his son to follow him into religious life. This is not an unusual expectation. Across every tradition, the expectation that children will carry forward what their parents valued is one of the most consistent human patterns. The rabbi saw in his son something he wanted to preserve, and the vehicle he chose for that preservation was the rabbinate. The problem was that his son did not find what he needed in that vehicle. What he found it in, what he discovered could hold his particular quality of energy and need and hunger for attention, was comedy. Comedy and the rabbinate are not as far apart as they appear. The best religious teaching has always had an element of performance, of timing, of the ability to make a point land through the vehicle of a well-constructed story rather than through direct instruction. The rabbi and the comedian are both in the business of holding an audience's attention while conveying something they want that audience to receive. The tools are similar. The ends are different, and it is the different ends that estranged the Krustovsky family for so long. Krusty chose the audience's laughter over the audience's soul, and his father could not forgive this. The choice felt, from the rabbi's perspective, like a repudiation of everything that mattered. From Krusty's perspective, the choice was the only authentic one available to him, the one path through which he could be genuinely himself rather than a performance of his father's expectations. And then he became a performance of a different set of expectations, which is the bitter irony at the center of Krusty's entire story. Having rejected his father's vision of what he should be, Krusty constructed a commercial persona that is equally manufactured, equally a container for other people's projections, equally something he wears rather than something he is. The clown is not more authentic than the rabbi would have been. It is differently inauthentic. But the inauthenticity serves Krusty rather than his father, and that distinction, trivial as it may appear from the outside, was apparently worth the cost. The cost was his father. The cost was his community. The cost was the specific kind of home that comes from belonging to a tradition that knows who you are and has a place for you within its understanding of the world. Krusty traded all of that for a television show and a merchandise empire and an audience of children who love a character rather than a person. There are episodes that explore what Krusty actually wants, underneath the commercial apparatus and the habitual performance. The most significant is the episode in which he attempts a reconciliation with his father, brokered by Bart, accomplished through a piece of scholarship that establishes that Jewish law does not prohibit comedy, and that a Jew can be a comedian without being in violation of anything his tradition genuinely requires. This reconciliation works. The rabbi and the son find each other again. And the emotional weight of the reconciliation, the relief in both of them, reveals how much the estrangement has cost them both. But the reconciliation does not change Krusty fundamentally. He remains the same commercially motivated, emotionally avoidant, personally chaotic individual after the reconciliation as before. The healing of the father-son relationship does not produce a new Krusty. It produces the same Krusty with one less wound. And one less wound is meaningful, genuinely meaningful, but it is not the same as transformation. This is one of the things The Simpsons understands about emotional healing that is rarely made explicit. It does not produce different people. It produces the same people with slightly less damage to manage. Krusty's reunion with his father does not resolve the patterns that led to the estrangement in the first place. Those patterns, the need for audience approval, the inability to sustain genuine intimacy, the use of professional performance as a substitute for personal authenticity, are still fully operational. The father has forgiven the son. The son has been forgiven. But the son is still the son. The clown is still the clown. Now let us examine the professional dimension of Krusty's double life more carefully, because the show has populated it with detail that rewards attention. Krusty's relationship with his own television program is the most sustained expression of his fundamental disconnect between what he presents and what he is. The show is nominally a children's entertainment program. Its actual content is a mixture of violent slapstick, thinly veiled adult humor, and product placements that sometimes directly contradict each other in the same episode. Krusty does not write the show. He does not appear to have any genuine creative input into its content. He appears, performs the minimum required to fulfill his contractual obligations, and departs. The gap between the brand and the person is enormous and visible to anyone who spends time in proximity to both. Within the show's narrative, several episodes have depicted the behind-the-scenes reality of the Krusty operation in ways that make clear the brand is entirely separate from the man. Krusty is unhealthy. Krusty has addictions. Krusty has made financial decisions that suggest either genuine innumeracy or a profound indifference to his own long-term well-being. He has been financially defrauded by his own business associates on multiple occasions, apparently because he does not read the agreements he signs. This is not incompetence in the straightforward sense. Krusty is not a stupid man. He has navigated a career in entertainment for decades with enough success to maintain both his cultural prominence and his commercial operation. He understands how the business works at the level required to keep functioning within it. What he lacks is any apparent interest in translating that functional understanding into genuine oversight of his own affairs. His money is someone else's concern. His contracts are someone else's problem. His business interests are managed by people who have, repeatedly, not managed them in his interest. The pattern of exploitation is consistent enough to stop being a coincidence. Krusty has been cheated by the people who manage his affairs so many times that it begins to look less like a string of bad luck and more like a man who has organized his professional life specifically to avoid having to pay attention to it. If the money is managed badly, Krusty does not have to think about it. If the contracts are wrong, Krusty does not have to engage with their details. He can simply perform. He can simply be the clown, in front of the camera, doing the things the clown does, and everything else can be someone else's problem. This is avoidance at an extraordinary level of sophistication and sustained over an entire professional lifetime. Krusty has constructed a career that gives him the things he needs, specifically the audience attention, the immediate gratification of performance, the sound of children laughing, while protecting him from the things he cannot handle, specifically sustained intimacy, genuine accountability, the kind of adult engagement with consequence that his emotional history has made extremely difficult to sustain. He had a daughter, Sophie, who appears in a storyline where the collision between Krusty's professional self and his personal reality becomes unavoidable. Sophie is the product of a relationship during a conflict zone, a relationship Krusty did not know had produced a child until years later. The episode in which they connect is one of the show's best explorations of Krusty as a genuine person rather than a comedic vehicle. He wants to be a good father. He genuinely wants this. And he is, in the specific terms of the episode, good enough. He shows up, he tries, he does the things a father is supposed to do. But the episode exists in the same episodic structure as everything else in Springfield, which means Sophie does not appear regularly in subsequent seasons, and the relationship Krusty so obviously needs, the one genuine intimate connection that could anchor him to something real, returns to the background where the show keeps things it has introduced but cannot sustain. This is not only a production decision. Within the show's logic, it is consistent with who Krusty is. Krusty cannot sustain the intimate connection, not because he does not want it, but because the mechanisms that would allow him to sustain it, the ability to be consistently present, consistently honest, consistently himself rather than consistently performing, were not developed in him, or were damaged in him, or were traded away at some point in his history for things he needed more urgently. Krusty has entertained generations of Springfield children. He has been the face of their childhood entertainment, the presence they associated with happiness and permission, and the particular quality of delight that good comedy produces in a young person. And he has done this while being profoundly unable to access for himself the things he was so good at producing for others. He gave children joy. He has not been particularly good at having it himself. The double life of Krusty the Clown is not the double life of a hypocrite. It is the double life of someone who found, early in his development, that the only space where he could be fully present was a space defined by performance. The stage, the camera, the audience, these are the environments in which Krusty functions with something approaching his full capability. Everything outside of them, the financial management, the intimate relationships, the sustained engagement with consequence, is a world he moves through with the particular kind of barely managed difficulty that characterizes someone who is performing even in the absence of an audience, because they do not know how not to. The clown face is not makeup. It is the most honest thing about Herschel Kristofsky. It is the face he put on when he was young and needed a container for everything he was and could not express in the way his father needed him to express it. He has been wearing it ever since. And under it, in the spaces between performances and between episodes, is a man who genuinely does not know what his face looks like when nobody is watching. The brand and the man. Krusty's most significant contribution to the cultural life of Springfield is also his most thorough self-betrayal. the creation and maintenance of a brand that is entirely separate from the person who carries it. The Krusty brand is, by any commercial measure, a remarkable achievement. It has lasted decades. It has survived multiple scandals that would have destroyed less robust brands. It has been extended across a merchandise empire of such breadth that Krusty's face appears on products whose connection to entertainment or to Krusty himself is, at best, metaphorical. He has become a presence in the cultural life of Springfield's children that is as ambient and as foundational as the power plant's glow on the horizon. Always there, part of the landscape, not really noticed anymore as something extraordinary because it has been there for so long. The brand did this, not Krusty. The brand is what sustains and what endures. Krusty is the nominal origin of the brand, the face that launched the empire, but he has long since become an employee of his own creation rather than its author. He shows up to fulfill the brand's requirements. He performs what the brand needs performed. He signs what the brand needs signed. And the brand, in exchange, provides him with the one thing he cannot provide for himself: an audience. The audience is the only currency Krusty has ever genuinely valued. This is clear from the beginning and consistent through every episode that engages with his character seriously. The money matters in the sense that Krusty knows he needs it and is distressed when he does not have it, but it does not motivate him in the deep sense. The critical acclaim that some of his more serious professional efforts have occasionally attracted genuinely pleases him, but does not sustain him. The industry recognition and the professional relationships and the various other rewards that an entertainment career generates are all fine, but none of them is the thing. The thing is the audience, the specific, immediate, real-time confirmation that a room full of people is responding to what you are doing with the response you intended to produce. This is what Krusty lives for, and the brand's primary function for him is that it guarantees the audience. The brand ensures that when Krusty walks onto a stage, there will be children there to receive what he performs. It buys the audience and then Krusty provides the performance. The arrangement works. It has worked for decades. It will probably continue to work. What it does not work for is the thing on the other side of the performance. The life that exists when the audience has gone home and the stage lights are off and there is nothing to perform for and no one to confirm the performance was received. The brand guarantees Krusty the audience. It does not guarantee him anything else. And anything else is what Herschel Kristofsky has been, in the spaces between performances, unable to find. The father he could have been. There is a specific version of Krusty that the show has never fully explored, but that is implied by the evidence of the episodes that engage most directly with his character. The Krusty who, given genuinely different circumstances, could have been an extraordinary father. The specific quality of engagement he brings to his interactions with Bart is evidence of this. Bart's relationship with Krusty is one of the stranger and more touching of the show's many character relationships. Bart genuinely idolizes Krusty in the way that children idolize the people who represent the things they most want to believe are possible. And Krusty, when he is in contact with Bart, has a quality of engagement that is different from his engagement with most adults. More immediate, more responsive, more present. Krusty knows how to talk to children, not in the condescending or managed way of adults who have learned the professional vocabulary of child engagement, in the way of someone who genuinely finds the directness of children's responses refreshing, who responds to the unfiltered quality of children's enthusiasm with his own form of unfiltered engagement. When Krusty is good at his job, which he is, intermittently and genuinely, this quality is the source of his effectiveness. Children respond to him because he responds to them as real people with real reactions, rather than as an audience to be managed. This is a gift. It is the gift of the comedian who is also capable of genuine connection, who can be present for an individual rather than always performing for the aggregate. Krusty has this gift in the specific context of children, and he has never been given the circumstances in which it could develop into something sustained. Sophie was the opportunity. Sophie was the child who arrived when Krusty was old enough to understand what he had not had and young enough, at least in the specific terms of his relationship with her, to want to provide it. The episode in which they connect is the show's most direct portrait of the Krusty who could have been engaged, present, trying in the specific and effortful way of someone who knows they are working against their own patterns, but who wants the result enough to try. He was good at it, within the episode's terms. Not perfect. Not the father that Sophie, or any child, deserves without reservation. but genuinely trying, and genuinely present, and in the moments of greatest connection between them, genuinely there in a way that was not performance. And then the episode ended and the loop resumed and Springfield continued, and the father that Krusty could have been returned to the background from which he occasionally emerges and into which he consistently retreats. The show's treatment of Sophie is one of its most honest acknowledgments of something it usually prefers to leave implicit, that the floating timeline and the reset button do not serve all characters equally. For Homer, the reset allows new adventures without consequences. For Krusty, the reset removes the opportunity for the development that his character most needs. Every season that passes without Sophie appearing regularly is a season in which Krusty's most genuine chance at the kind of connection that might break his loop does not materialize. The reset for Krusty is not a reprieve. It is a recurring denial. The show within the show. There is a final dimension of Krusty's story that the show has never quite made explicit, but that the structure of his situation implies: the relationship between his program and the children who watch it. Krusty's show has been running within the show's universe for as long as Krusty has been a public figure. The children of Springfield have grown up watching it. Bart's devotion to Krusty, which is one of his defining characteristics, was formed through years of watching a specific person on a screen and developing the specific quality of attachment that parasocial relationships produce. The sense of knowing someone, of having a relationship with someone, of caring about what happens to someone, without any of the reciprocity that characterizes actual relationships. Bart does not actually know Krusty. He knows the Krusty the show produces. He knows the performance, which is real in the sense that the performance is genuinely expressive of something about the performer, but which is also not identical to the person. The devotion Bart feels for Krusty is genuine devotion directed at a projection rather than at a person. This is not unusual. It is what parasocial relationships are, and the show, in its various explorations of the Bart-Krusty relationship, has consistently honored both the genuineness of Bart's feeling and the gap between the projection and the person. When Bart encounters Krusty as a person rather than a performer, the reality of that encounter is always more complicated than the devoted fan-to-idol relationship that is the relationship's public form. The show Krusty runs is, in the most direct sense, the vehicle through which he shapes the inner lives of Springfield's children during their most impressionable years. What they take from it, what values and what assumptions and what models of human behavior they absorb from years of watching Krusty perform his particular version of entertainment, is one of Springfield's most significant forms of cultural transmission. And what Krusty transmits, deliberately or not, is the specific worldview of a man who found his truest self in performance, and who has built his entire life around the maintenance of the performance, even at the cost of everything outside it. The children who watch Krusty's show learn, from Krusty's example, that performance is the primary currency of human interaction, that the way you appear to others is the primary form of who you are, that the audience's response is the primary measure of value. These are not the lessons anyone would claim to be teaching. They are the lessons that the performance, consistently maintained across years of viewing, quietly delivers. The comedy that costs him. Krusty's comedy is real. This is the thing the show has always been careful to establish alongside every revelation about the gap between Herschel Krustofsky and the character he performs. That the performance itself is genuine at some level, that the laughter it produces in children is real laughter, that the connection Krusty creates with an audience in the moment of the performance is not manufactured or fraudulent, even when the person doing the creating is deeply compromised in every dimension outside the performance. The comedy that costs him is the comedy that works, the bits that land, the moments where children in the audience are completely present with him, where the laughter is full and free, and the connection between performer and audience is as complete as any human connection gets. These moments are what Krusty lives for, and they are also the moments that confirm, every time they happen, that the performance is where he is most fully himself, which means the performance is also where the absence of everything outside the performance is most acute. He is most alive in the act of performance. He is most himself in front of the audience. And every time this is confirmed by the specific quality of connection that a successful performance produces, it also confirms that the self that is most fully present in the performance is a self that cannot be present anywhere else in the same way. He is the clown in full in the performance. He is the man who needs the clown in everything else. And the gap between these two is the specific, private, unperformable sadness of Krusty the Clown, which is the sadness of someone who has found the conditions under which they are most fully themselves, and that those conditions are temporary and require an audience, and end when the audience goes home. Every comedian in the real world who is honest about their experience describes some version of this. The stage is where they are most themselves. The silence after the stage is the most difficult silence. The transition from performance to ordinary life is a transition from the version of themselves that works to the version that is still figuring out how to work. Krusty is an extreme expression of this common experience. Someone who made the gap so complete, who built the performance self so elaborately and invested in it so thoroughly, that the gap between performance and not performance became the defining feature of his existence. He could have managed this differently. The rabbi offered a model of how a person could find their fullest self in service to something that sustained connection rather than requiring its absence. The reconciliation with his father offered the possibility of integrating what Herschel was with what Krusty had become. Sophie offered the specific possibility of a sustained one-on-one connection that did not depend on an audience, and that might have provided the confirmation of personhood that the audience provides only temporarily and only in aggregate. He could not hold any of these. Each offering was real and each was ultimately returned, not because Krusty refused them, but because the person who received them did not have the architecture to sustain them. The performance self had been built at the cost of whatever architecture normally sustains the quieter kinds of connection. And rebuilding that architecture, at the point in his life where the show encounters him, is a project that would require dismantling enough of the performance self to begin, and the performance self is the only thing Krusty knows how to be that works. So he performs. He goes out every day and he performs, and the children laugh, and he is most fully himself for those hours, and then the performance ends and the silence comes, and Krusty goes back to being Herschel in a world that does not know what to do with Herschel and never particularly has. The reconciliation's unfinished work. The episode in which Bart brokers the reconciliation between Krusty and his father, Rabbi Krustovsky, is one of the show's most emotionally complete 30 minutes. The estrangement was real. The pain was real on both sides. The reconciliation was genuine. The father and son who had spent decades separated by a specific disagreement about what a life of meaning looked like were reunited by a child who cared enough about both of them to do the work of bringing them together. And then the rabbi died, in a later season, and the reconciliation's unfinished work became clearer. What Krusty and his father had managed to do was restore the relationship to a state of basic positive connection. They had resolved the estrangement. They had found their way back to each other. But the decades of separation had created a gap in lived experience that reconciliation cannot simply close, a gap in the accumulated small moments of being present to each other. That is the actual substance of a relationship, and that cannot be replaced by the fact of reconciliation, however genuine. You can reconcile with someone. You cannot get back the years of not being reconciled. The years in which the relationship was absent are not restored by the restoration of the relationship. They remain as years in which the thing that was absent, and the people who did not have it during those years are people who did not have it, regardless of what they have now. Krusty lost his father for decades. He got his father back for some years at the end. The getting back was real and was worth having. But the getting back did not erase the loss, which is the specific, irreducible quality of the kind of time that cannot be recovered. It can be succeeded by better time, but not replaced by it. This is what the reconciliation episode does not quite say, but that the subsequent death of the rabbi makes legible in retrospect. Krusty and his father had not enough time. They would not have had enough time even if the rabbi had lived another decade. The decade and a half of estrangement had used time that the relationship needed and that the reconciliation could not return. The reconciliation was right and it was worth doing, and it was not enough, because in this specific case, enough was not available to be had. Krusty carries this. He carries it in the way he carries everything that has not worked out, in the way that something as essential as a father's love should work out. In the performance, where the energy that has nowhere else to go finds its most consistent outlet, and in the silences between performances, where the weight of what did not happen, what was not enough, what came too late, is present in the way that unresolved things are always present in the silences of people who have unresolved things. The show moves on. Krusty performs. The children laugh. And somewhere underneath the face paint and the performance and the decades of accumulated comedy, Herschel Krustofsky is still the boy who chose the audience over his father's blessing and is still not certain, across all the years and all the performances and all the laughter, whether he chose correctly. Number. Section 8. The real truth about the Simpsons' wealth. The Simpson family is poor. This is one of the foundational premises of the show. Homer works a blue-collar job at the power plant. The family lives in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood. Money is a consistent source of anxiety. Bills arrive and create problems. Major expenditures require sacrifice. Homer and Marge have, across dozens of episodes, faced financial crises that required them to make genuinely difficult choices about how to allocate resources that were never quite sufficient for the life they were living. All of this is true, and none of it is the whole story. The Simpson family's financial situation is one of the most systematically analyzed subjects in Simpsons fan discourse, and for good reason. The numbers, when you try to add them up, do not add up. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has, by various estimates based on its size, location, and amenities as depicted across the show's run, a market value that places it significantly above what Homer's salary at the power plant should support. The family eats well. The children are clothed. The car is operational. The refrigerator is full. The television is large. The lifestyle, while not affluent by any conventional measure, is consistently more comfortable than Homer's stated income would appear to justify. There have been various attempts to explain this gap through the show's own canon. Homer has had secondary income sources. He has been an inventor, a food truck operator, a small business owner, a musical performer, and approximately 300 other things in addition to his primary employment. Most of these ventures have ended badly, but some have generated income that could, in theory, supplement the baseline. Marge has worked at various points. The family has received inheritances and windfalls and gifts that, taken together, might explain the gap between income and lifestyle. But none of this fully accounts for what the show actually depicts. The Simpson family does not live like a family with a single blue-collar income and periodic supplements. They live like a family with a single blue-collar income that has been significantly supplemented by something that is never fully disclosed. The house is too good. The vacations are too frequent. The problems, while real, are not the problems of genuinely financially precarious people. They are the problems of people who are uncomfortable but not desperate, who have enough buffer to absorb shocks that would be catastrophic to a family genuinely living at the edge. The most interesting explanation is not the one the show provides through its scattered secondary income stories. The most interesting explanation comes from the deal we established earlier, the arrangement between Grandpa Simpson and Mr. Burns, in which Grandpa's silence about a specific crime was exchanged for Homer's guaranteed employment regardless of his performance. A deal of that nature, made between a private citizen and the wealthiest man in Springfield, would not be limited to simple job security. Job security is the minimum. What Grandpa negotiated, and what Burns agreed to because the alternative was considerably more expensive, was a permanent subsidized relationship between the Simpson family and Burns's empire. Homer keeps his job. Homer keeps his salary. Homer presumably keeps his benefits, his access to the plant's resources, his position within the economic structure that Burns controls. But the deal also implies something about the nature of the compensation. Burns does not make deals that cost him more than the alternative. The deal with Grandpa, whatever its specific terms, was made because the cost of the deal was less than the cost of not making it, which means the deal was not particularly generous in absolute terms. Burns would not have offered more than he had to. He would have offered the minimum necessary to secure Grandpa's silence. Which brings us back to the gap. If the deal was the minimum necessary to secure silence, and if the minimum produced a family whose lifestyle consistently exceeds what their stated income should support, then one of two things is true. Either Homer's salary is considerably higher than the show has suggested, or there are additional financial arrangements connected to the deal that the show has not explicitly depicted. The second possibility is more interesting. Burns's deal with Grandpa was about silence. Silence about something specific that Burns had done. That thing, whatever it was, presumably had ongoing financial and legal implications for Burns. The deal would not end at Homer's employment. It would require maintenance. It would require, at minimum, that Grandpa remain silent not just at the moment of the deal but indefinitely, which means ongoing incentives to maintain that silence. In the world of Burns's operation, ongoing incentives look like ongoing arrangements. Perhaps the house has terms that are not standard. Perhaps there are accounts, quietly maintained, that do not appear in any conversation the show has about the family's finances. Perhaps there are arrangements that Grandpa made that he did not fully explain to Abe's son or to his son's family, because explaining them would require explaining the whole story, which would require disclosing the thing that was supposed to remain undisclosed. The Simpson family's wealth, such as it is, may be built on a foundation that none of them, except possibly Grandpa, fully understands. They live a life that is slightly better than they can formally account for, in a house that is slightly nicer than their income officially supports, in an arrangement with their largest employer that is considerably more complex than the standard employment relationship. And Homer, who is too cognitively compromised to work through the arithmetic of his own situation, never notices. He worries about money in the episodes where the show needs him to worry about money, and then the money problem resolves and he goes back to the plant, and Burns fails to remember his name and the arrangement continues. This is not an unusual arrangement in Springfield. It is actually one of the most common ones. The town is full of people whose material situations are slightly disconnected from what their visible circumstances would predict, because Burns's empire is shot through the local economy in ways that produce exactly these kinds of asymmetries. People who know things that would be inconvenient, people who are in positions that require management, people whose continued cooperation with the existing arrangement is necessary for the arrangement to continue. All of these people receive their adjustments. Not enough to make them affluent, enough to make the deal worth keeping. The Simpson family is comfortable enough to not be desperate, and not so comfortable as to be independent. That sweet spot, that specific level of material sufficiency that is above the threshold of genuine hardship but below the threshold of genuine freedom, is not an accident. It is a policy. It is what Burns's management of Springfield's economy produces for the people who are too close to his operation to be left genuinely precarious, but too useful in their current state to be genuinely empowered. Homer is at the center of this policy because Homer, as the safety inspector whose failures keep the plant's violations hidden, is the most important person in Burns's operational infrastructure. His continued employment is not charity, and it is not the product of a deal alone. It is a necessity. A competent safety inspector would cost Burns everything. Homer, in his compromised state, costs Burns a salary and some quiet arrangements about a house. The economics are clear, even if Homer cannot see them. Now let us talk about the house itself, because 742 Evergreen Terrace is one of the most analyzed fictional addresses in the history of television, and the analysis consistently reveals something interesting. The house is larger on the inside than it appears from the outside. This is a production artifact, a simple result of the show's need to fit different set configurations into the same building exterior. But within the show's own logic, the house's interior geography is genuinely inconsistent. The number of bedrooms changes, the basement appears and disappears. The garage is sometimes present and sometimes irrelevant. The backyard is sometimes large enough to accommodate significant events and sometimes barely present. The house is, in a word that applies to many things in Springfield, impossible. This impossibility has been explained in various ways. Animation convention, artistic license, the show's general indifference to internal spatial consistency. But under the frameworks we have been developing throughout this analysis, the house's spatial inconsistency takes on a different character. If the coma theory is operative, the house is whatever Homer's unconscious mind needs it to be in a given moment. Dreams do not maintain spatial consistency. The house in Homer's dream is assembled from impressions and needs, rather than from a fixed mental map. Some nights it is the big house he wanted for his family. Other nights it is the small house that reflects his anxieties about providing for them. The spatial inconsistency is the spatial inconsistency of a dreaming brain running the same simulation with slightly different parameters each time. If the radiation theory is operative, the house's inconsistency might reflect something about the way that chronic environmental exposure affects spatial perception and memory. People who live in highly polluted environments sometimes develop cognitive patterns that affect how they remember and perceive space. This is speculative in terms of the specific mechanisms involved, but consistent with the broader pattern of cognitive effects that the radiation theory predicts. And if the principle and the Popper collective denial theory is operative, the house's inconsistency is simply another thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. The number of bedrooms changed? Nobody mentions it. The basement was gone for 2 seasons? Nobody remarks on its return. The collective agreement to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality extends to domestic geography as well as civic history. The house is whatever the family needs it to be, and the family has learned not to question this, because questioning it would be the beginning of a thread that, when pulled, keeps going. The Simpson family wealth question, in its simplest form, is a question about whether what you can see accounts for what is. In Springfield, the answer is consistently no. The visible surfaces of the town's economic and social life do not account for the full complexity of what is actually operating underneath them. The house is bigger than it looks. The family is more comfortable than their income explains. The arrangement Homer has with his employer is more complicated than a simple employment relationship. And the accumulated effect of all these small gaps between the visible and the actual is a picture of a family that exists at a precise point in the Springfield power structure, comfortable enough to be compliant, precarious enough to be dependent, too embedded in the existing arrangement to see it clearly, and too compromised by decades of environmental and psychological damage to do much about it even if they could. The Simpsons are not rich, and they are not poor. They are exactly what Burns's Springfield produces as its standard human output. People who are adequately provided for in exchange for their continued participation in an arrangement that serves someone else's interests far more than their own. Homer does not know this. Marge suspects it, at some level. The way Marge suspects many things that she has learned to set aside in the interest of maintaining the family's stability. Bart does not think about it. Lisa thinks about it constantly but lacks the specific biographical and financial information that would allow her to make the argument fully. And Maggie watches, and remembers, and says nothing, and waits. The real truth about the Simpsons' wealth is that it is not theirs. It was granted to them, in a specific form and at a specific level, by someone who had reasons for granting it that had nothing to do with their well-being. They live in Burns's house, effectively. They eat Burns's food. Homer works in Burns's plant, and Marge maintains Burns's most important asset, which is the family unit that keeps Homer stable enough to continue showing up every day. The Simpsons family is, in the most literal economic sense, a managed asset within Burns's portfolio, and they sit on their couch every evening, in their slightly too nice house, eating their slightly better than they can explain food, watching their slightly larger than expected television, and they are happy. Homer is happy. Marge is content. The children are children. And somewhere on the other side of town, behind the walls of a building that emits a faint and terrible glow, a very old man in a very expensive suit sits at a very large desk and reviews the ledger and finds that the arrangement is working precisely as intended. The lights are on in Springfield. The plant is running. The water is flowing, yellow and warm, and slightly wrong. From every tap in town, Homer will be at his workstation tomorrow. The safety violations will continue unexamined. The deal Grandpa made will continue to protect a family that does not know they are being protected, or what the protection is protecting them from, or what they would have to give up if they ever asked the wrong question at the wrong moment. The Simpsons are fine. They are always fine. That is the agreement. That is the arrangement. That is the deal that was made before Homer was old enough to understand that a deal was being made, and that will continue until the day the plant stops running, or the treatments fail, or the town finally asks the question it has been carefully not asking for 36 years. And in the meantime, the family is on the couch. The television is on. The couch gag plays. Springfield is exactly as it was the last time you visited, and the time before that, and the time before that. Some things do not change. In Springfield, that is not a comfort. It is a policy. Number final thoughts. Everything connects. We have spent several hours in Springfield together. We have followed Sideshow Bob through decades of releases and returns, and examined the infrastructure that keeps a man like him operational. We have sat with the question of what came back when Bart recovered his soul, and whether the question has an answer that the show is willing to give. We have mapped the criminal ecosystem that underlies Springfield's civic surface and traced its lines of connection to the people with the most to gain from its continued operation. We have looked at the Flanders family and found, behind the cheerful exterior and the neighborly goodwill and the relentless performance of Christian virtue, the architecture of people who were shaped without their consent and have spent their lives making meaning out of the shaping. We have sat with Moe at his bar in the bad light and understood, maybe, why the light is bad and why Moe has never fixed it. We have walked the hallways of Springfield Elementary, and recognize the school for what it is. Not a failure, but an accomplishment, successful in the specific and limited terms of what it was actually designed to produce. We have watched Krusty perform his double life across decades of television and seen beneath the grease paint and the commercial apparatus a man who found his truest self in front of an audience and has never quite been able to find it anywhere else. And we have looked at the Simpson family's comfortable, slightly too good for their income life and recognized the invisible deal that produced it. Every one of these stories connects to the others. Every thread, when followed, leads to the same center. Springfield is a system. It is a carefully maintained, constantly adjusted, deliberately opaque system designed to produce specific outcomes for specific people, and it does this with an efficiency that would be remarkable if it were not also so quietly devastating. The town does not fail its residents by accident. The school does not fail its students through simple neglect. The legal system does not fail to contain its most dangerous actors through incompetence alone. These failures are too consistent and too directional to be random. The question that every mystery in Springfield eventually arrives at is the same question: who benefits? Not from this specific episode's events, but from the overall arrangement, from the town's chronic amnesia and institutional ineffectiveness and population of cognitively compromised, emotionally damaged, perpetually distracted people who work in a plant they should not work in, and drink water they should not drink, and live in a town that the federal government classified as a contamination zone and then sealed in a glass dome, and they were still inside the dome when it went up. Burns benefits. Burns has always benefited. Burns will continue to benefit until the treatments fail, or the money runs out, or something unprecedented happens in a town that has made precedent impossible. But Burns alone does not explain all of it. Burns explains the corruption of the institutions and the management of the population and the specific arrangements around Homer's employment and his family's material comfort. Burns does not explain Moe's loneliness or Krusty's emotional avoidance or Ned's psychological cage or Sideshow Bob's obsessive loop or the question of what came back with Bart's soul. Those stories are the human residue of the system, the accumulated cost of living inside Springfield's arrangement for a lifetime. They are what people become when the system works on them long enough. The system is Burns. The stories are everyone else. And the show, across 36 seasons and more than 780 episodes, has been telling us both things simultaneously: the system and the stories, the structure and the humans inside it, the machinery and the people. The machinery is running through. It has told us these things in comedy, in song, in animation, that violates realistic human proportion in ways that the radiation theory says are not accidents. It has told us in the gaps between jokes and in the moments where the comedy frame briefly drops and something genuine shows through before the frame reassembles, and the laugh track returns and the loop continues. The show knows. It has always known. It knows what Springfield is and what Burns is doing and what the school is producing and what Moe is protecting himself from and what the Flanders family is concealing behind its elaborate performance of goodness. It knows because the people who write it are highly educated observers of how systems work and what systems do to people and what happens to the human things inside a system that serves the wrong interests. And it has been encoding that knowledge into every episode for 36 years, not hiding it at all, laying it out in plain view for anyone who chooses to look. The mystery of Springfield is not whether these things are true. The mystery is why, knowing all of it, we keep watching. Why we tune in and laugh and find comfort in these impossible people living their impossible lives in their impossible town. Why the loop, which should by now be exhausting, is instead something more like home. And the answer, the one that sits at the bottom of every analysis and every theory and every extended journey into the Springfield rabbit hole, is deceptively simple. Because they are us. Not metaphorically. Not as a cute observation about the universality of family dynamics. Literally, the Simpsons family is a model of the choices real families make under real systemic pressure. Homer's inability to see the architecture of his own suffering is not a cartoon exaggeration. Marge's patient maintenance of a structure that serves her family at significant personal cost is not an animated cliché. Lisa's daily negotiation between her extraordinary perception and the limitations of the world that perception is trapped in is not a character beat. These are the actual conditions of actual people living in actual systems that are designed, like Burns's Springfield, to produce compliance, and extract value, and maintain the existentially matterable two problems of combination of comfort and damage, and the steady erosion of the cognitive capacity that would be required to do anything about any of it. Springfield is everywhere. Springfield is the town where you grew up, or the city where you live, or the neighborhood you drive through on the way to work. The power plant has a different name. Burns has a different face. The three-eyed fish is something else, some other local impossibility that everyone has agreed to accept as part of the landscape. The school fails in slightly different ways. The police protect slightly different interests. The bar has a different sign above the door, but the same bad light and the same man behind the counter who has been there longer than is probably good for him. And the family is on the couch. And the couch gag plays, and the opening credits roll and everything is familiar, and a little wrong and somehow still warm, still a place you recognize as yours, still the version of home that you return to even when you know, in the part of you that the show taught you to use, that you should probably be asking more questions about why the fish has three eyes. Maybe tomorrow you will ask. Maybe the next episode will be the one where someone in Springfield finally looks up and demands an accounting. Or maybe the loop will continue as it has for 36 years, as it will probably continue for however long the show runs, which, given everything we know about this town and the people who built it, may be a very long time indeed. The lights are still on in Springfield. Someone is keeping them on. And in the blue television light of a house on Evergreen Terrace, a family is together on their couch, and that is still, despite everything, something worth watching. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. The children who will not stay young forever. There is a version of the question that the floating timeline is designed to prevent that deserves to be asked anyway. What does Bart Simpson become when he grows up? The show has imagined this, in flash-forward episodes that the loop then retracts. The versions of adult Bart that the show has depicted are consistent in their broad outlines. A man who has not quite found what he is for, who carries the specific gifts of his childhood, the confidence, the creativity, the specific bravado that made him the most memorable 10-year-old in television history, into an adult context where those gifts do not automatically translate into the structures of adult success. He is still recognizably himself. He has not become someone unrecognizable. But the specific version of himself that was most vital and most fully expressed at 10 has not found an adult context that accommodates it in the way that Springfield Elementary, however inadequately, accommodated it at 10. Bart's gifts are the gifts of a child who has not been told that certain things are impossible. The confidence that produced the pranks and the challenges, and the genuine heroism, the willingness to act when action is needed without waiting for permission or certainty, the specific relationship with rules as things to be understood rather than simply obeyed. These are real gifts. They are also gifts whose expression in adult contexts is considerably more complicated than their expression in childhood, because the adult world has more invested in compliance than the childhood world does, and Bart's gifts are not particularly oriented toward compliance. The question the show cannot ask, because asking it would require the loop to release him, is whether the Springfield that produced these gifts in Bart also equipped him to navigate their expression in the adult world. Whether the school that processed him as a management problem rather than a developmental opportunity provided the frameworks that would let him translate his specific intelligence into forms that the adult world could receive. And reward. Whether the community that Burns' influence shaped over decades produced, in Bart Simpson, the kind of adult that a community organized around human flourishing would have produced? The answer that the evidence suggests is no. The gifts are real. The infrastructure to support their adult expression is not there. Bart will become someone who has the raw material of an exceptional life and the formation of someone whose community was not organized around helping him build it. And Springfield will not notice the loss, because Springfield does not notice the losses it produces. It does not notice the three-eyed fish, or the cracked cooling towers, or the billionaire who glows in the dark, or the principal who is not who he says he is, or the baby who shot a man, or the old man who keeps dying and keeps coming back, or the mother whose son has worked for her persecutor his entire adult life. Springfield does not notice its losses because noticing them would require the kind of sustained critical attention to its own situation that the radiation and the deal and the collective denial and the institutional capture have all combined to make very difficult to sustain. But the losses are real. The fish has three eyes. The boy will grow up eventually into the man his formation produced. The town is the town it is because the specific people with the specific interests spent the specific decades making it that way. And the loop that holds them all, the floating timeline and the reset button and the couch at the end of every episode, is the mechanism through which all of this is sustained without ever quite being acknowledged. The house on Evergreen Terrace holds the family. The deal holds the house. The loop holds Springfield. And somewhere in a hospital in a town that does not appear on any map, or in a contamination zone sealed by the federal government, or in the actual Springfield wherever it actually is, the family sits down on the couch and the television comes on and another episode begins. Bart is 10. He will always be 10. The show will never tell you what he becomes. But you already know. You have always known. Springfield showed you. The loop we built together. We have spent 4 hours in Springfield. We went looking for mysteries, and we found something more uncomfortable. A town that is exactly what it was designed to be, producing exactly the outcomes it was designed to produce, and doing so in a way that is invisible to the people inside it because the design includes the production of their invisibility to it. The loop is not broken. The loop is working. That is the most unsettling conclusion that all of these theories, from every angle and every approach, arrive at. Springfield is not a tragedy of dysfunction. It is a portrait of a system functioning as designed, producing human damage at scale and sustaining the conditions of its own continuation through the very damage it produces. And we watch. We tune in. We settle into the couch that matches their couch, and we laugh at Homer, and we root for Bart, and we love Lisa, and we are comforted by Marge, and we do not ask, for the duration of the episode, the questions that the show is quietly asking us to ask. The show has been asking for 36 years. It is still asking. The question is always the same. Are you watching, or are you just watching? Good night, Springfield. The loop will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point.